My name is Sienna, and at 33 years old, I thought I was finally going to get a peaceful Christmas. Instead, my parents invited me home for a quiet holiday dinner, only to ambush me at the front door. They dumped my sister's unruly kids into my arms, announced they were flying to Paris for a luxury vacation, and drove off. They treated me like free childcare and a convenient scapegoat. They thought they had trapped me. They had no idea that within hours, I would uncover a massive financial fraud that would leave them stranded overseas, facing federal charges. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been taken advantage of by family members who thought you were too weak to fight back. The drive to my parents' upscale suburban New York estate had been my first moment of peace in months. As a forensic accountant, I routinely worked 70-hour weeks untangling complex corporate financial webs. This was supposed to be my first actual 6-day vacation in 2 years. I pulled up the sweeping circular driveway of the house I grew up in, anticipating the smell of roasted turkey and a quiet evening by the fireplace. But the moment I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors, the illusion shattered. The grand foyer was not decorated for a cozy family dinner. Instead, it looked like a staging ground for an international expedition. A mountain of pristine Louis Vuitton luggage was piled high against the curved staircase. My father Harrison stood by the door checking his platinum watch. My mother Barbara was busy adjusting a beige cashmere scarf in the entryway mirror. Beside them stood my older sister Chelsea, scrolling aggressively on her phone while wearing a floor-length designer puffer coat. The tension in the room was suffocating. I barely had time to register the scene before Harrison shoved 2 heavy canvas duffel bags directly into my chest. The sudden weight forced me to step backward. "The boys' schedules are taped to the refrigerator," Harrison said, his tone clipped and entirely devoid of warmth. "Leo is strictly allergic to dairy, so watch the labels. Mason needs his tablet charged at all times, or he refuses to sleep. We will be in Paris until the 28th. Do not call us unless someone is bleeding, and even then, call an ambulance first." I stood frozen, clutching the bags, as my brain struggled to process the sheer audacity of his words. Paris. I repeated the syllables, feeling foreign in my mouth. "You are going to Paris tonight." "What are you talking about? I was invited here for Christmas dinner." "There is no dinner," Barbara interjected, turning away from the mirror. She offered a tight, unsympathetic smile. "We ordered some pizzas for you and the boys. They should arrive in an hour. Be a dear and tip the driver." My voice rose despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I cannot babysit the boys. I work exhausting hours. I am finally on vacation. I need to rest. I literally brought my encrypted company laptop just in case of an emergency. I cannot play nanny for 6 days while you go on a European holiday." Chelsea finally looked up from her phone. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes, with the exact same condescension she had perfected when we were teenagers. "God, Sienna, do not be so selfish," she snapped. "I am completely exhausted from being a full-time mother. I desperately need this European reset to focus on my mental health. You just sit in a cubicle and play with spreadsheets all day. You have no idea what real stress is." The unfairness of her statement burned. Chelsea had never worked a day in her life. She lived entirely off her husband David and the generous allowances our parents continually funneled into her bank account. She spent her days at Pilates classes and expensive brunches while relying on a rotating cast of nannies to raise her children. Now she was dumping them on me without a second thought. I dropped the duffel bags onto the marble floor. The heavy thud echoed through the high-ceilinged foyer. "I said no," I told them firmly. "I am leaving. I am not doing this. Call your nanny or cancel the trip." Barbara stepped forward, her face hardening into a familiar mask of maternal disappointment. "Stop throwing a tantrum, Sienna," she scolded, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Family helps family. We paid your rent that one time during your sophomore year of college when you were struggling. You owe us for that. It is time you finally pulled your weight around here and acted like a supportive sister for once." I stared at her in sheer disbelief. They had paid exactly 1 month of rent over a decade ago after threatening to cut me off entirely if I did not change my major from accounting to something more suitable. I had paid them back with my first corporate bonus. Before I could articulate the absolute absurdity of her argument, a loud honk pierced the air from the driveway. The private airport shuttle had arrived. Harrison grabbed the nearest set of suitcases. "That is our ride," he announced, pushing past me. He did not look back. Chelsea followed closely behind, tossing her phone into her designer handbag. "Good luck with the kids," she tossed over her shoulder. "Do not let Mason eat sugar after 8. Barbara was the last to leave. She offered me one final look of profound judgment, shook her head, and walked out into the freezing December evening. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them, the sound ringing with dreadful finality. I stood alone in the center of the vast empty foyer, listening to the hum of the shuttle engine fading down the street. I was completely stranded. They had genuinely ambushed me, trapped me in their home, and fled the country. I pressed the heels of my hands against my temples, trying to stave off a massive headache. The silence of the house felt heavy, unnatural. I took a deep breath, telling myself I needed to formulate a plan. I would call David and force him to come collect his children. I would order a car for myself and drive back to the city. I was an adult, and I did not have to stay here and be subjected to this blatant exploitation. But as I turned around to head toward the kitchen, the silence was shattered by a sudden violent crash from the upstairs landing. The sound of crunching plastic and splintering glass made my blood run cold. I sprinted up the curved wooden staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. When I reached the top landing, my heart stopped. Standing there right in the middle of the hallway was 7-year-old Leo, holding the shattered, jagged remains of my $3,000 encrypted company laptop. The screen was completely cracked down the middle, the casing bent at a horrible, unnatural angle, exposing the internal hardware and severed wires. He looked down at the ruined machine, then looked up at me without even a single trace of genuine remorse or childlike guilt in his eyes. A slow, deliberate smirk spread across his face. "Oops," he said softly before tossing the broken pieces onto the floor. The plastic casing of my customized workstation lay scattered across the expensive Persian rug. I stared at the ruined hardware spilling from the cracked chassis. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violent rhythm. This was not just a broken piece of technology. This was a direct line to a secure cloud server hosting the financial data for a major corporate merger. I had a non-negotiable deadline of midnight to authorize the payroll audit for over 3,000 employees. Without my authorization, the merger would stall, and millions of dollars would hang in limbo. My entire career as a senior forensic accountant rested on completing that transfer tonight. Leo kicked a rogue keycap across the hallway. He crossed his arms and stared at me, waiting for a reaction. Behind him, 5-year-old Mason began to wail loudly, rubbing his eyes and demanding his tablet. A primal scream built in the back of my throat, but I forced it down. Panic was a luxury I could not afford right now. I had less than 6 hours to find a secure terminal, bypass my company security protocols, and finish the audit. I grabbed Leo by the wrist. My grip was firm enough to let him know the game was over, but gentle enough to avoid leaving a mark. I marched him down the curved staircase with Mason trailing behind us, still crying for his screen. I dragged them straight into the massive living room and shoved them onto the oversized leather sectional. I grabbed the remote, turned on a loud animated movie, and cranked the volume. I threw a bag of organic pretzels onto the coffee table. "Do not move from this couch," I ordered, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that finally wiped the smirk off Leo's face. "You do not touch the television. You do not leave this room. If either of you moves an inch before I come back down, I will unplug the internet router, and you will never watch a screen in this house again." They stared at me in stunned silence. Chelsea had clearly never spoken to them with actual authority. Satisfied that shock would keep them planted for at least 20 minutes, I spun around and sprinted back up the stairs. I headed straight for the end of the hallway to my father's private home office. Harrison always kept a high-end desktop computer for his day trading and personal investments. I grasped the brass doorknob and twisted. It was locked. Of course he locked it. Harrison guarded his private sanctuary like a military bunker. I did not have time to search the entire house for a spare key. I stepped back, raised my boot, and kicked the heavy door right next to the latch. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the door swung open, hitting the wall with a thud. I did not care about the property damage. He could take it out of the babysitting fee he owed me. The office was dark, lined with rich mahogany bookshelves and smelling faintly of expensive scotch and cigars. I rushed to the massive oak desk and jiggled the mouse. The dual monitors flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across the room. A password prompt blinked mockingly on the login screen. I let out a sharp breath of frustration. I pulled out my phone and dialed my father. They had to be at the airport lounge by now, waiting to board their transatlantic flight. He answered on the fourth ring over the loud background noise of a busy terminal. "What do you want, Sienna?" He snapped, his tone heavy with irritation. "I told you not to bother us unless someone was bleeding." "Your grandson just destroyed my work computer," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I have a critical audit due by midnight. I need the password to your desktop right now so I can access a secure server." There was a scoff on the other end of the line. The sound was so dismissive it made my blood boil. "Do not be ridiculous, Sienna. I am not giving you the password to my private computer." "Harrison, this is not a joke," I insisted, gripping the edge of the desk. "My career is on the line. If I do not authorize this payroll, my firm will lose a major client. It will take me exactly 20 minutes to log in and finish the job. Give me the password." "Stop snooping through my things." My father exploded, his voice rising above the airport chatter. "I know exactly what you are doing. You have always been a jealous, hysterical girl trying to ruin your sister's happiness. You probably made up this whole emergency just to cause a scene, because you cannot stand that Chelsea gets to go to Paris while you have to stay behind and finally do something useful." "That is a complete fabrication," I fired back, gripping the phone tighter. "Chelsea dumped her kids on me without asking. You locked me in a house with 2 destructive children and no way to do my job. Give me the password, Harrison, or I am calling the police and reporting the kids as abandoned." "You will do no such thing," he snarled. "You are going to sit there and do your duty to this family. Stay out of my office, Sienna." The line went dead. I stared at the call-ended screen in pure disbelief. I immediately dialed him back. It rang once before diverting straight to voicemail. I tried my mother. Straight to voicemail. I tried Chelsea. Straight to voicemail. They had all blocked my number. They had actually stranded me and cut off all communication. A cold, calculated calm washed over me. The frantic panic evaporated, replaced by the laser-sharp focus that made me one of the top forensic auditors in my firm. Harrison thought a simple alphanumeric password could keep me out. He clearly forgot what I did for a living. I spent my days breaking through layers of corporate encryption, tracking hidden assets, and exposing financial crimes. A basic consumer operating system was child's play. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys. Attached to the ring was a heavy-duty titanium flash drive I carried everywhere. It contained a suite of diagnostic tools and bypass software I used for emergency data extraction. I plugged the drive into the back of Harrison's computer tower and restarted the machine manually, holding down the keys to boot directly from the USB port. The screen went black before filling with lines of white text as my custom operating system bypassed his hard drive entirely. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing command lines with practiced speed. I isolated the security registry, located his user account file, and stripped the password encryption straight out of the system architecture. The entire process took less than 4 minutes. I rebooted the machine normally. This time the login screen did not ask for a password. It simply welcomed me and loaded the desktop. I grabbed the mouse, ready to open a fresh browser window and log into my cloud server, but I stopped dead. The desktop was not empty. Harrison had not just locked his computer, he had left it running with several applications minimized on the taskbar. Front and center, dominating the large screen, was an open email application. He must have been reading it right before they rushed out the door. The subject line was flagged with red urgent markers and typed entirely in bold capital letters. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the text. My heart, which had just started to slow down, suddenly slammed against my ribs with a renewed, terrifying intensity. The email was from the billing department of an ultra-luxury assisted living facility on the other side of the state. It was not a newsletter. It was not a routine update. Final notice, eviction proceedings for Beatrice Wells. I read the words again, feeling the air get sucked out of the room. Beatrice Wells was my grandmother. She was 82 years old, recovering from a mild stroke, and supposed to be living comfortably in a premier care suite that my parents constantly bragged about funding. I grabbed the mouse and scrolled down through the body of the message. The language was cold, clinical, and legally binding. The facility administrator was informing Harrison that the account was severely delinquent. The monthly care fees had not been paid in 8 months. The outstanding balance was staggering. They were officially initiating an emergency discharge protocol. My vision blurred as I read the final paragraph. If the account is not brought current by the end of the business day, Beatrice Wells will be forcibly removed from the premises and transferred to a state-run overflow ward. I sat back in the leather office chair, the leather squeaking loudly in the silent room. 8 months. Harrison and Barbara had not paid my grandmother's medical bills in 8 months. Yet they were currently boarding a first-class flight to Paris with Louis Vuitton luggage, planning to spend the next 6 days skiing in the Swiss Alps and drinking vintage champagne. The hypocrisy was sickening, but the math was what really disturbed me. I knew exactly how much my father made. I knew the value of his stock portfolio. There was absolutely no logical reason for him to be defaulting on nursing home bills unless something was catastrophically wrong with their finances. I forgot all about my corporate audit. The payroll would have to wait. I opened a new tab on the browser and moved my mouse toward the minimized banking windows Harrison had left running in the background. If my parents were willing to let my grandmother be thrown onto the street while they vacationed in Europe, I was going to find out exactly where her money had gone. I clicked the Minimize tab for Vanguard National Bank. The page refreshed, demanding a 2-factor authentication code. Harrison had set it to send a text to his phone. I grimaced. I could not access his phone because he was currently at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. But Harrison was a creature of habit. He hated being inconvenienced by security protocols. I opened his email client and searched the trash folder. Sure enough, he had routed backup authentication codes to his secondary email. I grabbed the 6-digit number, pasted it into the bank portal, and hit enter. The financial dashboard loaded in a flash of green and white. I scanned the summary page and felt the blood drain from my face. My parents' joint checking account was overdrawn by $400. Their primary savings account, which used to hold a healthy 6 figures, was sitting at a terrifyingly low balance of $2,000. They were completely broke. They had been hemorrhaging money for months, living far beyond their means to keep up appearances at their exclusive country club. But right below the empty savings accounts sat a glaring anomaly, a massive brand new line of credit. $500,000 had been deposited into a clearing account just 2 weeks ago. My fingers flew across the keyboard. As a forensic accountant, I knew that banks did not just hand out $500,000 in unsecured cash to people with overdrawn checking accounts. There had to be collateral, heavy collateral. I navigated to the loan documents section of the portal. I downloaded the origination file and opened the PDF. The header read Commercial Equity Line of Credit. I scrolled down to the property listed as collateral. Silver Lake Manor. I stopped breathing. Silver Lake Manor was not my parents' house. It was my grandmother's sprawling lakeside estate, the home she and my grandfather had built 40 years ago, the home she intended to pass down to all her grandchildren. Harrison did not own that property. He had no legal right to leverage it. I scrolled furiously to the final page of the loan agreement, searching for the signature block. There it was, Beatrice Wells, signed electronically via a commercial document signing platform. The platform embedded a digital certificate at the bottom of the page, verifying the time and location of the signature. I recognized the format immediately. I pulled up the system settings on the desktop and checked the IP address of the machine I was currently using. I compared the string of numbers to the digital certificate on the loan. They matched perfectly. Harrison had not just taken out a loan. He had sat in this exact chair, clicked a button, and forged his own mother's digital signature to steal $500,000 against her home. He committed felony bank fraud. And he did it while simultaneously refusing to pay the very facility that was keeping her alive. I remembered the conversation from Thanksgiving last year. Harrison had stood in the kitchen swirling a glass of bourbon, complaining loudly to Uncle Frank. "She does not need that massive lake house, Frank. She barely knows what day it is anymore. The estate is just sitting there gathering dust while the rest of us actually have lives to fund." I had walked out of the room disgusted by his greed. I had no idea he was already laying the groundwork to steal it right out from under her. A loud crash echoed from the living room downstairs, followed by Mason's shrill crying. The organic pretzels were clearly not holding their attention anymore. I ignored them. I had to follow the money. $500,000 was a massive injection of cash. I pulled up the transaction history for the clearing account. I could see the immediate outward flows. $12,000 to Air France for first-class tickets, $25,000 to a luxury chalet rental agency in the Swiss Alps, $8,000 to a high-end Parisian boutique. They were literally funding their vacation with stolen money while my grandmother faced eviction. But the math did not add up. Even with their extravagant spending, the Paris trip only accounted for maybe $50,000. The overdrawn checking account absorbed another few thousand. That left an enormous chunk of the loan completely unaccounted for. Where was the remaining $440,000? I dove deeper into the bank's interface, navigating to the wire transfer queue. Harrison was sloppy. He had not cleared his cache or deleted his recent transfer templates. I filtered the search for outgoing wires over $10,000 within the last 14 days. The screen refreshed. One transaction dominated the page. A single outbound international wire transfer executed just 72 hours ago. The amount was exactly $300,000. I clicked on the transaction details, my eyes scanning the routing information. The destination was not a local bank. It was a financial institution in the Cayman Islands known for its strict banking secrecy laws and relaxed corporate oversight. The beneficiary was not a person. It was a corporate entity listed as Crimson Rose Holdings, LLC. Why would Harrison wire $300,000 of stolen money to an offshore shell company? It made no sense. He was a regional manager for a logistics firm, not an international money launderer. He did not have the sophistication to set up a Cayman Island shell company on his own. I minimized the banking portal and opened a secure tab using my own virtual private network. I accessed an international corporate registry database that my accounting firm paid a premium for. It was a tool designed to pierce corporate veils and identify the actual human beings behind anonymous LLCs. I typed Crimson Rose Holdings into the search bar and hit enter. The database churned for a few agonizing seconds before pulling up the registration documents. The company had been incorporated exactly 3 weeks ago. The registered agent was a local law firm in the Caymans. I scrolled past the boilerplate legal jargon, searching for the managing director or sole proprietor. The screen loaded the final page. I stared at the name printed in stark black letters. It was not Harrison. It was not Barbara. A secondary wire transfer confirmation popped up on the screen, cross-referencing the corporate registry data. $300,000 of the fraudulent loan was just wired to a private offshore shell account, registered solely in my golden child sister Chelsea's name. I stared at the name glowing on the high-resolution monitor. Chelsea Wells. My sister, the woman who constantly complained she was too exhausted by motherhood to function, was actively running an offshore shell corporation. I grabbed my cell phone from my back pocket to call her husband David, but immediately remembered my father had blocked my number. Chelsea likely had too. I needed a line they could not ignore, or better yet, a number David would answer without suspicion. I bolted from the mahogany office and jogged down the curved staircase, ignoring the loud sounds of the animated movie blaring in the living room. I found the heavy cordless landline phone sitting on the granite kitchen island. David was a genuinely good man. He was a senior structural engineer who worked grueling hours to fund Chelsea's insatiable appetite for luxury spa days and designer clothes. He was also fiercely devoted to Leo and Mason. The fact that he had not come to the house to say goodbye to his own children before they were dumped on me was the first glaring inconsistency. I punched in his cell phone number from memory. He answered on the second ring. Harrison David asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Is everything okay with the house? I thought you guys were already on your way to the airport." "It is Sienna," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "And I need you to tell me exactly what you know about Crimson Rose Holdings." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sienna, why are you calling from the house landline? And what is Crimson Rose?" I gripped the edge of the cold granite counter. "Do not play dumb with me, David. The Cayman Islands Shell Company. The one that just received a $300,000 wire transfer from my father. Your wife is listed as the sole managing director. Where is that money going?" "Sienna, I literally have no idea what you're talking about," David said, the profound confusion in his voice entirely genuine. "What wire transfer? Chelsea does not have any offshore accounts. We share a joint checking account at Chase. And why are you asking about this right now? Chelsea is at a digital detox wellness retreat in Sedona. She does not even have her phone." I froze. The expansive kitchen suddenly felt droppingly cold. "Sedona," I repeated slowly. "Yes." David sighed, sounding like a man carrying the weight of the entire world. "She said she was having a maternal burnout crisis. She booked a 6-day silent retreat in Arizona, no technology allowed. Harrison and Barbara took the boys to the Hamptons for the week so I could focus on closing a massive architectural bid for the firm." My forensic accountant brain shifted into overdrive, aligning the disparate pieces of data into a crystal clear and terrifying picture. Chelsea was not in Sedona. Harrison and Barbara had not taken the kids to the Hamptons. They had dumped Leo and Mason on me, explicitly stating they were all flying to Paris together. But David did not know any of this. He had been fed a completely different narrative to keep him isolated and oblivious while they executed their plan. And then there was the money. $300,000 funneled into an untraceable offshore account solely in Chelsea's name. A woman who claimed she was at a digital detox, but was actually boarding a first-class flight to Europe. It was a classic asset concealment strategy. I saw it all the time in high-net-worth divorce audits. One spouse slowly siphons marital funds, hides them in a shell corporation, and establishes an untouchable nest egg right before serving divorce papers, leaving the other spouse financially ruined and completely blindsided. But Chelsea had taken it a massive step further. She was not just hiding David's hard-earned money. She had convinced our father to steal $500,000 from my grandmother's estate to fund her getaway and pad her secret account. She was preparing to blow up her marriage, and she was using stolen family assets to finance her escape. "David," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, realizing I was about to detonate a bomb in this man's life. "Chelsea is not in Sedona." "What do you mean?" I literally saw the itinerary. I am standing in my parents' foyer. My parents and Chelsea just dumped Leo and Mason in my lap 20 minutes ago. They had a mountain of Louis Vuitton luggage. They ordered a private airport shuttle. They are currently on their way to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. The silence on the line was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a fatal car crash. I could hear David breathing over the receiver, the sound shallow and rapid as his mind struggled to reject the reality I was handing him. "David." I pressed on, refusing to let him live in the dark for another second. "My father forged my grandmother's signature to take out a $500,000 line of credit against her house. He wired $300,000 of that stolen money into a Cayman Islands account registered exclusively to Chelsea. She is hiding money, David. She is hoarding cash where you cannot touch it, and she abandoned your children with me to go to France." I waited for the denial. I waited for him to call me a liar, to aggressively defend the woman he had loved and supported for a decade. But David was a smart man. He analyzed structural weaknesses for a living. He knew when a foundation was irreparably compromised and ready to collapse. The joint account, David whispered, his voice cracking. She asked me to transfer my annual bonus into the joint account yesterday to cover the property taxes. It was $80,000. Log in and check it right now, I commanded. I heard the frantic clicking of a keyboard in the background. A sharp, ragged intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. It is gone, David said, his voice hollow, completely devoid of emotion. The entire account is drained. She transferred it out this morning. Chelsea had taken everything. She had taken his bonus, she had taken my grandmother's home equity, and she had abandoned her children to drink champagne in Paris. She was setting David up to take the fall for a devastated marital estate while she lived untouchable across the globe. She played him for an absolute fool. Sienna, David said, his tone shifting rapidly from shock to a cold, frightening resolve. Keep my boys safe. Do not let them out of your sight. I am calling my lawyer. The line clicked dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the blank digital display. David was mobilizing. Chelsea had vastly underestimated the man she was trying to ruin, and now the fallout was going to be biblical. I placed the cordless phone back onto the charging cradle on the kitchen counter, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I needed to get back upstairs. I needed to secure the remaining funds in Harrison's checking account and lock down the compromised server before my client's corporate merger fell through. But before my hand could even leave the plastic receiver, the landline rang. The shrill electronic tone sliced through the quiet kitchen, making me jump. I snatched it up immediately, expecting David calling back with more frantic questions about the boys. "Hello," I answered, pushing my hair out of my face. "Is this the residence of Harrison Wells?" a stern, uncompromising female voice asked. "He is not available. Who is this?" "This is Brenda Carmichael, the facility director at Silver Lake Assisted Living." The woman stated, her tone entirely devoid of pleasantries or patience. "I am calling to inform the family that our financial grace period has officially expired. We have not received the required payment. Our security team is currently packing Beatrice Wells' belongings right now. She is being transferred to the state-run ward by midnight." I slammed the receiver onto the cradle. I did not waste a second trying to negotiate with Brenda over the phone. I sprinted back to the living room where Leo and Mason were glued to the television. "Get your coats on right now," I ordered, snatching my car keys. "We are leaving." Leo crossed his arms and slouched deeper into the cushions. "No," he whined. "Mom said we do not have to listen to you. We are watching a movie." I grabbed the remote and clicked the television off. The silence made both boys shriek in protest. I grabbed Leo by the collar and hauled him to his feet. Mason started wailing immediately, throwing his body weight onto the floor. I scooped the 5-year-old up, completely ignoring his thrashing limbs. "I am not playing games with you," I said, my voice carrying a dangerous edge. "We are getting in the car. Move!" I marched them out the front door and shoved them into the back seat, clicking their seatbelts into place. The drive took 20 agonizing minutes. The boys screamed and kicked my seat the entire way, demanding their mother. I ignored the chaos, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind raced through a dozen different scenarios. $40,000 in arrears. Even on my salary, I did not keep that kind of liquid cash sitting in a standard checking account. My money was tied up in mutual funds that would take 3 business days to liquidate. I needed a certified check to halt an eviction, and the banks were shut down for the holiday weekend. Harrison knew exactly what he was doing. He timed this so no one could intervene. I pulled up to the grand entrance. The building looked like a sprawling country estate with manicured hedges and cobblestone walkways. It was a beautiful facade masking a ruthless corporate machine. I killed the engine, dragged the screaming boys out of the back seat, and hauled them right through the automatic glass doors. The lobby was an expansive room filled with wingback chairs and a stone fireplace. Right in the center of the polished marble floor stood my grandmother. Beatrice Wells was 82 years old, but she sat in her wheelchair with the straight posture of a woman who had never bowed to anyone. She was wearing her finest wool coat, her silver hair styled, and her hands folded neatly in her lap. Behind her stood 2 burly security guards and an orderly pushing a brass luggage cart piled high with her belongings. Standing in front of Beatrice was a tall woman in a sharp gray suit holding a clipboard. Brenda Carmichael. "Stop right there!" I shouted, storming across the lobby. I pulled Leo and Mason along with me, their continuous screaming echoing against the high ceilings. Brenda Carmichael turned to look at me, her expression immediately souring at the noise. "Miss Wells," she said, eyeing my disheveled appearance and the two children dangling from my hands, "I assume you are here to facilitate the transfer. We have the transport van waiting out back." "There is no transfer," I shot back, letting go of the boys to step directly between my grandmother and the security guards. "You are not putting an 82-year-old woman out on the street in the middle of winter." "I am afraid the matter is entirely out of my hands," Brenda replied, her voice maintaining that awful customer service cheerfulness that completely lacked human empathy. "Your father, Harrison Wells, has ignored our billing notices for 8 consecutive months. The outstanding balance is exactly $42,500. Corporate policy mandates an immediate discharge for any account delinquent past 90 days. We were quite generous giving him this long. He is currently out of the country." I argued frantically, racking my brain for a solution. "I am his proxy. Give me until Monday morning when the banks open. I will wire you the funds directly from my own accounts." Brenda shook her head, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "I cannot do that. The grace period expired at 8 p.m. tonight. Unless you have a certified check for the full $42,000 in your pocket right now, the discharge proceeds. State facilities have a bed waiting for her. It is not our problem that your father mismanaged his finances." The boys sensed my distress and used the distraction to escalate their rebellion. Mason threw himself onto the lobby floor, kicking his sneakers violently against the marble tiles and shrieking at the top of his lungs. Leo giggled maliciously and began ripping the leaves off a nearby decorative potted ficus tree, tossing the dirt onto the pristine floor. Several elderly residents who had been reading in the lounge area stared at us in open disgust. The scene was an absolute nightmare of public humiliation. "I cannot process an electronic payment of that size over a weekend," I pleaded with Brenda, ignoring the dirt flying through the air. "You have to give me 48 hours. You cannot just throw her in a van." "Security," Brenda said smoothly, gesturing to the men behind my grandmother. "Please proceed with the transport. This is a private facility and they are creating a disturbance." The guards moved forward, reaching for the handles of Beatrice's wheelchair. "Stop it!" I yelled, lunging forward to grab the wheel. Mason wailed louder, rolling in the spilled dirt. Leo kicked the heavy brass base of the luggage cart, sending a suitcase tumbling to the floor. The chaos reached an unbearable crescendo. "Enough!" The single word cut through the air like the crack of a leather whip. It was spoken with such absolute chilling authority that the entire lobby froze. Leo dropped a handful of dirt. Mason stopped wailing mid-breath, his mouth hanging open. Even the 2 security guards physically halted their advance, stepping back from the wheelchair as if they had just been scolded by a general. Beatrice Wells slowly turned her head and looked at my nephews. The glare she leveled at them was so terrifyingly calm that Leo actually took a step backward, hiding behind my leg. "You will brush the dirt off your trousers. And you will both stand by the door without making a single sound until I say otherwise." Mason scrambled to his feet so fast he nearly tripped. They scurried over to the glass doors and stood shoulder to shoulder, completely paralyzed by shock. Beatrice turned her attention entirely away from the 2 terrified boys and looked up directly at the stunned facility director. "I am fully aware of your billing policies," Brenda Beatrice replied, reaching a steady hand into her vintage leather purse. She pulled out a small, sleek wallet and opened it. Beatrice carefully withdrew a remarkably thick, heavy metal credit card from the center slot. It was solid black, devoid of any typical bank logos, bearing only a subtle silver emblem. It was the legendary American Express Centurion Black Card, reserved strictly for multimillionaires. A card with absolutely no preset spending limit. Beatrice casually tossed the heavy metal card onto Brenda's clipboard. "Run it for the full year?" Beatrice instructed, her tone dropping to a glacial chill. Beatrice turned her wheelchair slightly to face me. "Harrison actually thinks he has finally drained me completely dry." She looked me dead in the eye. I think it is time we called my real lawyer. I stared at the heavy manila envelope resting on the polished mahogany desk. The red notary seal looked like a drop of fresh blood against the pale paper. My name was typed across the front in a crisp, uncompromising font. For my entire adult life, my family had treated me as the reliable, boring worker bee. The one who calculated the numbers, paid her own way, and cleaned up the messes they left behind. They thought I lacked the killer instinct required to play in their league. They had fundamentally misunderstood what forensic accounting actually was. It was not just tracking numbers, it was hunting. I picked up the envelope. The thick paper felt substantial in my hands, carrying the weight of a multi-million-dollar estate and the power to absolutely annihilate the people who had tried to destroy us. Beatrice folded her hands in her lap, watching me with a steady, unblinking gaze. "Inside that envelope is the contact information for Arthur Vance," she said, her voice crisp and commanding. "He is the senior managing partner at Vance, Sterling and Hayes in Boston. They handle the blind trust. There is also a USB drive containing the encrypted digital keys to all my accounts, and the legal decrees proving Harrison's power of attorney is entirely null and void." "When exactly did you plan on telling me I controlled a multi-million-dollar trust?" I asked, tracing the edge of the wax seal with my thumb. "When you needed to know," Beatrice replied without a hint of apology. "Harrison is reckless, but he is also paranoid. If he suspected I had cut him out, he would have escalated his behavior much sooner. I needed him to believe he was in control while I quietly secured the perimeter. You were the only person in this family with the intelligence and the moral backbone to handle the responsibility. I knew that when the time came, you would know exactly how to execute the maneuver." She nodded toward the envelope. "The time has come, Sienna. Break the seal." I slid my thumb under the flap and ripped the envelope open. I pulled out a stack of pristine legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. On top was a silver USB drive, heavy and sleek. Below that was a direct priority phone number for Arthur Vance. I glanced at the clock on the desktop monitor. It was 10:15 on a Friday night. "Will his lawyer even answer at this hour?" I asked. Beatrice offered a cold, knowing smile. "Arthur Vance charges $1,200 an hour. He answers my calls if the world is actively ending or if I simply want to discuss the weather. Call him." I picked up my cell phone, punched in the priority number, and put it on speaker, setting it down next to the glowing monitors. The line rang exactly twice before a deep, resonant voice answered. "Arthur Vance." "Mr. Vance, my name is Sienna Wells. I am Beatrice Wells's granddaughter." There was a brief, sharp pause on the line. The sound of papers shuffling in the background immediately stopped. "Sienna, I have been expecting your call for quite some time. Is your grandmother with you?" "I am right here, Arthur," Beatrice said, leaning toward the phone. "And I am afraid we have a rather urgent pest control problem." "Understood," Arthur said, his tone shifting into immediate corporate warfare mode. "What is the situation, Beatrice?" I took the lead, my professional training overriding the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Approximately 3 weeks ago, my father, Harrison Wells, utilized a dummy deed to secure a $500,000 commercial line of credit through Vanguard National Bank. He forged Beatrice's digital signature on the loan origination documents. 72 hours ago, he wired $300,000 of that fraudulent capital into a Cayman Islands shell corporation registered to my sister Chelsea. I heard the sharp intake of breath over the speaker. Arthur Vance was a man who dealt in high-stakes wealth management. He recognized a catastrophic legal liability the moment it was spoken aloud. Vanguard issued $500,000 against a property owned by the Blind Trust. Arthur asked, the disbelief evident in his voice. They failed to run a secondary title verification. Harrison has been banking with them for 30 years. I explained, pulling up the digital certificate on the screen. He leveraged his private client status to bypass standard underwriting. The loan is entirely unsecured and the collateral is a ghost asset. Furthermore, Chelsea is currently abandoning her husband, David. She drained their joint checking account this morning and is using the Cayman funds to conceal marital assets. "And where are Harrison and Chelsea currently located?" Arthur asked, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. They are on an Air France flight to Paris, I said, glancing at the itinerary I had pulled from Harrison's email. They land at Charles de Gaulle Airport in exactly 4 hours. 4 hours, Arthur repeated. That gives us a very narrow but highly effective operational window. What are our immediate directives, Arthur? Beatrice asked, her posture rigid and unyielding. First, we activate Sienna's primary executorship across all platforms, Arthur stated. Sienna plugged the USB drive into the computer. There is an executable file named Vanguard Override. Run it. I grabbed the silver drive and slid it into the tower beneath the desk. A prompt appeared on the screen demanding a biometric confirmation or an alphanumeric passcode. I looked at Beatrice. The passcode is your grandfather's military serial number, she said softly. I typed the numbers from memory and hit enter. The screen flashed red, then green, granting me total administrative access to the actual accounts hidden behind the public-facing facade. The real numbers loaded. The blind trust held assets that made the $500,000 loan look like pocket change. I am in, I said. Excellent, Arthur continued, his voice sharp and methodical. Step 2 is asset immobilization. Sienna, you now have the legal authority to freeze every single account associated with Harrison Wells that lists Beatrice as a secondary or guarantor. Freeze them all. Checking savings, investment portfolios, everything. My fingers flew across the keyboard, checking boxes and initiating lockdown protocols on Harrison's financial dashboard. Accounts are frozen. He currently has zero access to domestic liquid capital. Step 3, Arthur said, is the kill shot. I'm going to contact the fraud division at Vanguard National Bank right now. I will provide them with the authentic trust documents proving the collateral is void and the signature is a forgery. Because the wire transfer crossed international borders to the Cayman Islands, this elevates the crime to federal wire fraud and international money laundering. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What happens when they land in Paris? Vanguard is legally obligated to immediately report international wire fraud of this magnitude to federal authorities. Arthur explained, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. The FBI will flag their passports through Interpol. When Harrison, Barbara, and Chelsea step off that plane and attempt to clear French customs at Charles de Gaulle, their passports will trigger an immediate red flag in the system. Will the French authorities detain them? Beatrice asked. They will not just detain them, Arthur corrected. They will seize all of their luggage, confiscate any technology they possess, and hold them in a secure holding facility, pending immediate deportation back to the United States to face federal indictment. Their luxury vacation is going to end in an interrogation room. I looked at the transaction history still pulled up on the monitor. The $12,000 for first-class tickets, the $25,000 chalet rental, the sheer breathtaking entitlement of it all. They thought they could throw my grandmother in a state ward and leave David destitute while they skied in the Alps. Do it, Arthur, Beatrice commanded, her voice ringing with finality. Execute the protocol. I am initiating the fraud alert with Vanguard now, Arthur said. Sienna, I will need you to sign an affidavit in the morning. Keep Beatrice safe and do not answer any calls from international numbers. The line disconnected. The silence in the mahogany office was profound, broken only by the faint, rhythmic hum of the computer tower. I leaned back in the leather chair, staring at the frozen accounts on the screen. The trap was set, the doors were locked, and the countdown had officially begun. My cell phone buzzed again. This time, it was a local number. I picked it up, recognizing David's contact information. I answered immediately. Sienna, David said, his voice trembling but laced with a dark, furious energy. My lawyer just drafted an emergency ex parte motion. We are filing for an immediate freeze on Chelsea's passport and a temporary custody order for the boys. But he says it might take 24 hours to get a judge to sign it. I am terrified she is going to empty whatever she has left and vanish into Europe. I looked across the desk at Beatrice, who raised a single elegant eyebrow. David, take a deep breath. I said, my voice steady and completely calm. You do not need to worry about Chelsea vanishing into Europe. She isn't going anywhere near a ski chalet. What do you mean? David asked, the confusion evident through the phone. You said she was landing in Paris. She is, I replied, pulling the USB drive from the computer and slipping it into my pocket. But she isn't going to make it past customs. I suggest you come pick up Leo and Mason David, and when you get here, you and I are going to sit down and prepare for the phone call she makes when she is allowed her one permitted call from International Holding. The drive back to my parents' sprawling suburban estate was the quietest 20 minutes of my entire life. Leo and Mason sat frozen in the back seat of my car, staring wide-eyed at the rearview mirror anytime Beatrice shifted in the passenger seat. My grandmother commanded an authority my sister had never even attempted to establish. The boys were terrified into absolute submission. When we walked through the heavy double front doors, the boys immediately marched themselves upstairs to their room without a single word of protest. I had less than 5 hours to complete the critical corporate payroll audit for my firm, but that deadline was entirely eclipsed by the massive financial crime unraveling in front of me. I guided Beatrice straight down the hallway and into Harrison's private office, shutting the splintered door firmly behind us. The harsh blue light of the dual monitors cast a cold glow across the room. I walked over to the mahogany bar cart tucked in the corner. I poured 2 thick fingers of his most expensive 20-year single malt scotch into a heavy crystal tumbler and handed it to her. She took it with a steady hand, taking a slow, deliberate sip as I pulled up the compromised banking portals on the screens. I laid out the digital evidence piece by piece, refusing to sugarcoat a single detail. I showed her the commercial line of credit originated through Vanguard National Bank. I pointed to the $500,000 deposit that had temporarily flushed the severely overdrawn checking accounts. I traced the outgoing offshore wire routing number directly to Crimson Rose Holdings in the Cayman Islands, an entity registered exclusively to Chelsea. I explained exactly how Harrison had used Silver Lake Manor as collateral, forging her electronic signature on the loan documents, while simultaneously refusing to pay the care facility that was keeping her alive. As a forensic accountant, I had unraveled embezzlement schemes for multinational corporations, but seeing it executed by my own blood was staggering. I expected outrage. I expected tears. I expected the devastating heartbreak of a mother realizing her own son was willing to leave her homeless and destitute to fund a luxury European vacation. Beatrice simply sat back in the leather guest chair and swirled the amber liquid in her glass. The ice clinked softly against the crystal in the quiet room. She looked at the glowing financial dashboards with an expression of mild amusement. "Harrison has always been remarkably predictable," she said, her voice completely devoid of shock or sorrow. 10 years ago, he stood in my kitchen and demanded I sign over my entire investment portfolio to his management. He told me I was becoming a financial burden and a liability to his public image. He stood right over me, jabbing his finger in my face, and said I was getting too old to manage my own affairs. He threatened to have me legally declared incompetent if I did not comply with his demands. I realized right then that my son saw me as nothing more than a walking ATM waiting to expire. I stared at her, completely stunned by the cold betrayal embedded in our family history. "You never told anyone," I whispered. "Complaining is for victims," Sienna Beatrice replied, taking another slow sip of scotch. "I prefer strategy." The day after his little tantrum, I hired a team of ruthless corporate estate attorneys in Boston. I legally transferred the actual deeds of Silver Lake Manor and every other piece of real estate I own into an ironclad blind trust. I removed myself as the direct title holder entirely. The documents Harrison found during his inevitable snooping, the ones he just submitted to Vanguard National Bank, are dummy files. They are completely worthless pieces of paper. I left them in an unlocked safe deposit box, knowing his greed would eventually get the better of him. He just committed federal bank fraud, using collateral that he does not own, and that legally does not even exist in my name. A harsh laugh escaped my throat. He thought he was outsmarting an old woman, but he walked right into a federal crime. My cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk, shattering the quiet moment. The caller ID flashed Aunt Diane. She was my father's older sister and the ultimate family gossip. She lived to enforce the family hierarchy and defend Harrison at all costs. Whenever there was a problem, Diane was the attack dog sent to put me back in my place. She was the one who always reminded me that I was the boring, plain sister while Chelsea was the star. I picked up the phone, hitting the speaker button so Beatrice could hear the incoming assault. "Sienna, what on earth are you doing?" Aunt Diane shrieked the moment the line connected, her voice echoing shrilly off the wood-paneled walls. "Your mother just texted me from the first-class lounge in Paris. She is in absolute tears. She says you are snooping through your father's private computer and calling David to spread malicious lies about Chelsea. Why do you always have to be the difficult child? You have been pulling these stunts since you were a teenager just to ruin your sister's happiness." I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles turning white. They abandoned my grandmother to be evicted, Diane. They abandoned their grandchildren with zero notice. They stole $500,000 and committed bank fraud. "Stop being so dramatic," Aunt Diane scoffed, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "Harrison had to move some assets around for a temporary cash flow issue. He is a financial genius, and you are just an accountant. You always blow things out of proportion to get attention. You are ruining their anniversary trip because you are jealous of your sister and bitter about your own boring life. Remember when you tried to ruin Chelsea's wedding by refusing to pay for her catering? You are doing it again. Stop trying to destroy this family and do your job. Just watch the kids and keep your mouth shut." The sheer toxicity of her words hung in the heavy air. For years, I had absorbed these verbal beatings. I had always tried to defend myself, to present logic to people who thrived on delusion. I had always tried to be the good daughter fixing their messes while they treated me like the hired help. I did not justify her delusion with a single response. I reached out and tapped the red button, ending the call instantly. The line went dead. I blocked her number with 2 quick swipes. There was no point in arguing with people who willfully chose to live in a lie. The entire family system was corrupt, protecting the golden children while expecting me to quietly sweep up the debris. I tossed the phone back onto the desk. Beatrice watched the entire exchange with a look of quiet, profound approval. She set her empty crystal tumbler down on a leather coaster. She unclasped the brass latch of her vintage handbag and reached inside. She bypassed her wallet and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The flap was sealed with thick red wax and stamped with a legal notary seal. She slid it across the smooth surface of the mahogany desk until it rested directly in front of my keyboard. "Harrison has spent the last 5 years thinking he holds a durable power of attorney over my medical and financial assets," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, icy register. "He struts around thinking he holds all the keys to my kingdom and that he can dispose of me whenever he pleases. He does not. I secretly transferred full executorship of the blind trust and my entire estate directly to you 3 years ago." I stared at the heavy sealed envelope, my heart hammering against my ribs. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the red wax seal. "Harrison thinks he has outplayed everyone. You just have to activate it." I ended the call with David and set the phone down on the polished mahogany desk. The quiet hum of the computer tower filled the silence. Arthur Vance had initiated the lockdown on the Vanguard commercial accounts, but a sudden jarring thought sliced through my adrenaline. I looked up at Beatrice. "Arthur said Harrison and Barbara land in 4 hours, I said, my voice tight with sudden realization. But Chelsea originally booked a separate flight. She wanted to arrive early to go shopping before checking into the ski chalet. If she took the direct red-eye, she is not in the air. She is already in France." I snatched my phone from the desk and immediately opened the Instagram application. My thumb tapped on Chelsea's profile. The glowing purple ring around her profile picture indicated a newly uploaded story. I clicked the icon. The screen illuminated with a pristine high-definition video. Chelsea was standing on the wraparound balcony of a lavish Paris penthouse. The Eiffel Tower glittered magnificently in the background against the dark night sky. She was wearing a stunning silk designer gown, laughing brightly as she clinked a crystal champagne flute against the glass of an unidentified man standing beside her. The caption overlay was written in an elegant cursive font right across the center of the video. It read, "So glad the hired help is watching the kids. #spoiled. #unbothered." The hired help. My blood ran completely cold. I was the hired help, while I was dragging her screaming children out of a high-end care facility to prevent our grandmother from being thrown onto the street. Chelsea was drinking vintage champagne in a penthouse paid for by stolen funds. She had abandoned her own sons without a single second thought, leaving them in my care while she funneled illicit cash into a Cayman Islands shell corporation. The sheer breathtaking entitlement radiating from the screen made me feel physically ill. I turned the screen around and slid the phone across the desk. Beatrice looked down at the video playing on a continuous loop. Her expression did not change, but the ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "She is exceptionally foolish," Beatrice stated smoothly, pushing the phone back to me. "Vanguard controls the commercial lines, but Harrison and Chelsea hold secondary black cards and global credit lines tied directly to my personal estate umbrella. Arthur Vance handles the primary trusts. We need the litigator to sever the personal credit." "Mr. Caldwell," I said, recognizing the dreaded name. "Exactly," Beatrice replied, her posture rigid and unyielding. "Set up an emergency secure video conference right now. Use the encrypted channel on Harrison's desktop. Caldwell has been waiting for my signal for 3 years." I navigated through Harrison's desktop applications and launched the secure corporate conferencing software. I typed in the direct priority meeting identification number that Beatrice recited perfectly from memory. The screen went black for a moment before the connection stabilized. The high-resolution video feed resolved to show a man sitting in a stark modern office overlooking the illuminated Boston skyline. Mr. Caldwell was a man who looked exactly like his terrifying reputation suggested. He was sharp, angular, and impeccably dressed in a dark charcoal-tailored suit. His gray eyes locked onto the camera with predatory intensity. He was universally known as the most ruthless, high-powered estate attorney on the East Coast. He specialized in dismantling massive financial empires and executing hostile asset reclamations. Beatrice Caldwell said, his voice crisp and entirely devoid of pleasantries. "I see you finally decided to pull the trigger." "It is time," Richard Beatrice answered, her voice matching his absolute chilling authority. "Harrison has crossed the Rubicon. He utilized forged dummy deeds to secure a $500,000 line of credit. I need you to initiate the total asset reclamation protocol immediately." Caldwell shifted his piercing gaze toward me on the screen. "Sienna, you have the blind trust digital keys." "I do," I confirmed, holding up the silver USB drive before plugging it back into the tower port. "I am transmitting the primary executorship credentials and the notarized affidavits directly to your secure server now." I initiated the heavy file transfer. A green progress bar flashed across the bottom of the screen. Caldwell remained perfectly still as he monitored his own terminal. The silence stretched for 30 agonizing seconds. I could hear the faint sound of his rapid keystrokes as he opened the encrypted legal files. "Credentials verified," Caldwell announced without a trace of emotion. "Digital signatures are authentic. The blind trust executorship is officially active in your name, Sienna. You now possess unilateral legal control over the entirety of the Wells family estate assets." He leaned forward, folding his hands neatly on his immaculate desk. His gaze seemed to bore right through the glass monitor. "Before we proceed, I must give you formal legal counsel regarding the magnitude of what you are about to do," Caldwell warned. "Activating your power of attorney to report this fraudulent $500,000 loan across the global banking networks is not a surgical strike. It is a nuclear option." I swallowed hard, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "Explain the exact parameters." "When I submit these authenticated documents to the federal fraud networks, it will instantly trigger a Tier 1 alert," Caldwell explained with clinical precision. "This alert will bounce to every major financial institution in the world within seconds. It will immediately freeze all of Harrison's, Barbara's, and Chelsea's active credit lines globally. I am talking about their Visa Black cards, their American Express accounts, their international debit cards, and any secondary emergency funds tied to their names." He paused, letting the heavy gravity of the situation settle in the quiet room. "They will not be able to buy a cup of coffee." Caldwell continued, his tone relentless. "They will not be able to pay for their luxury hotel. They will not be able to purchase return flights to the United States. You will be leaving them entirely stranded in a foreign country with zero access to liquid capital." If they attempt to swipe a card, the merchant will confiscate it. The moment I execute this command, there is absolutely no reversing it. They will be financially paralyzed until they face federal authorities. I stared at the monitor, a tight knot formed in the center of my chest. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was my family. This was my father, my mother, and my sister. Leaving them stranded in Europe with no money, no resources, and no escape route was an act of absolute devastation. They would be humiliated, terrified, and entirely helpless. The sheer magnitude of the destruction felt staggering. They would be thrown out onto the streets of Paris, wearing designer clothes with empty pockets. They would be forced to beg their embassy for assistance while the federal authorities prepared their arrest warrants. The comfortable, protective bubble they had lived in their entire lives was about to burst in the most violent way imaginable. My phone screen lit up again next to my keyboard. The Instagram story was still looping silently, Chelsea smiling flawlessly, raising her crystal glass of champagne in a penthouse she secured by participating in a massive financial felony. The caption stared back at me, daring me to back down. The hired help. I thought about my grandmother sitting in the lobby of Silver Lake Manor, surrounded by burly security guards waiting to be thrown out into the freezing winter night because her own son refused to pay her medical bills. I thought about the crippling panic I felt when Brenda Carmichael demanded $42,000 I did not have. I thought about Leo and Mason upstairs, abandoned by their mother, so she could play an untouchable billionaire in Paris without a single care in the world. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the way they had treated me as nothing more than a convenient servant meant to clean up their toxic messes while they reaped all the rewards. They had never hesitated to destroy my peace. They had never hesitated to steal my future to fund their delusions of grandeur. They viewed my compliance as a weakness, and my loyalty as an open invitation for relentless exploitation. I picked up the phone and looked at the glowing screen one last time. I pressed the power button, shutting off the display and turning the screen to pitch black. The hesitation vanished, completely replaced by a cold, untouchable clarity. I lifted my head and turned back to the video call with Mr. Caldwell. I met his calculating gray eyes. Freeze every single account, I said with absolute icy calm. Leo stood in the center of the living room, holding my smartphone out with two trembling hands. His triumphant smirk had completely vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated confusion. The screen displayed an active audio call with his mother, but the voice echoing from the speaker sounded nothing like the polished and perfectly curated version of Chelsea that the world usually saw. There were no sweet endearments. There was no soothing motherly comfort. Instead, a shrill, borderline hysterical shriek blasted through the phone, accompanied by the distinct echoing acoustics of a massive marble-tiled hotel lobby. "I am telling you to run the card again!" Chelsea screamed, her voice cracking with a frantic, desperate edge. "It is a Centurion card. It does not have a limit. Your machine is obviously broken. I am a premier guest, and I demand that you process the transaction manually right now." A calm, heavily accented French voice responded. The audio was slightly muffled, but the absolute disdain of the Parisian concierge was unmistakable. "Madame, I have run all 4 of your American Express cards. I have also attempted to authorize the 2 Visa signature cards provided by Monsieur Wells. Every single piece of plastic has returned a code 04. That is a hard freeze placed directly by your issuing financial institution. Furthermore, the bank has explicitly instructed our merchant services to retain the physical cards due to suspected fraudulent activity. I am afraid I must ask you to surrender the plastic and provide an alternative method to clear the €12,000 balance for the penthouse suite." "I am not giving you my credit cards!" Chelsea yelled, the sound of a heavy handbag slamming onto a hard surface vibrating through the phone. "Do you know who my father is? Get me your general manager right now." "The general manager is currently standing beside our head of security," Madame the concierge replied with lethal politeness. "If you cannot provide a valid method of payment, we will be forced to cancel your reservation and hold your passports as collateral until the local authorities arrive to investigate the attempted use of frozen assets." Leo stared at the phone, his lower lip quivering. He had never heard his mother sound so entirely out of control. He looked up at me, completely abandoning his previous rebellion. I walked over, gently took the device from his rigid grip, and pointed toward the kitchen. "Go wash your hands, Leo. Your dinner is ready on the table." He did not argue. He did not throw a tantrum. He turned and scampered away, clearly relieved to escape the terrifying audio assault. I walked straight down the hallway and back into the mahogany study where Beatrice was waiting. She sat in the high-backed leather chair, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of serene anticipation. I placed the phone in the exact center of the desk and tapped the screen, pressing the button to merge the active line with David, who I had kept waiting on silent hold. Chelsea finally realized the phone connection to her son was active. "Leo," she snapped, breathing heavily. "Put your Aunt Sienna on the phone this exact second." "I am right here, Chelsea," I said, leaning over the desk. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of the anxiety she usually demanded from me. "Sienna, what is wrong with the bank?" Chelsea demanded, her panic temporarily shifting back to her default extreme entitlement. "Call Vanguard right now. Call Harrison's private wealth manager and tell them my cards are declining. They need to lift the fraud alert. We have been traveling for 14 hours and these completely incompetent hotel employees are threatening to call the police over a simple banking glitch. Fix it, Sienna. Do your job." Before I could formulate a response, a deep, booming voice drowned her out. The sound of a brief physical scuffle came through the speaker, followed by heavy breathing. Harrison had snatched the phone right out of his daughter's hand. "Sienna." My father barked, his voice vibrating with the kind of narcissistic rage that usually sent everyone in our family running for cover. "I know you are listening to me, you vindictive little glitch. I do not know what kind of cheap parlor trick you pulled with my banking passwords to manufacture this inconvenience, but you are going to reverse it this exact second." I sat down in the chair across from Beatrice. "I did not hack your passwords, Harrison," I replied, keeping my tone clinically detached. "I did not need to. As of 1 hour ago, I activated my legal status as the primary executor of the Wells Family Blind Trust." There was a sudden dead silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of the Parisian lobby seemed to amplify in the heavy quiet. "What are you talking about?" Harrison demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous warning growl. "I hold the power of attorney. You are a glorified bookkeeper. You do not have the authority to access those files, let alone alter the administrative credentials." "You hold a power of attorney over a collection of dummy deeds and empty shell accounts," I corrected. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "Beatrice removed you from the actual estate trust 3 years ago. The documents you took from her safe deposit box are entirely worthless. Which brings us to the core issue of your current situation. As the legal executor of the estate, I was obligated to review the recent commercial line of credit you originated through Vanguard National Bank." The silence on the line stretched out thick and suffocating. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as the reality of his exposure began to dawn on him. "You leveraged a $500,000 loan using Silver Lake Manor as collateral." I continued, methodically reading the facts like I was presenting a quarterly audit. "You forged Beatrice's digital signature on the origination paperwork. You then wired $300,000 of that fraudulent capital into an offshore shell corporation registered to Chelsea." "You do not know what you are talking about," Harrison snapped. But the supreme arrogance was gone, replaced by the frantic tone of a cornered animal. "It was a temporary bridge loan, a simple restructuring of family assets. You are an insignificant little bean counter who has completely overstepped her bounds. You will transfer $50,000 from your personal savings into my checking account right now so we can secure this room and get a flight home. When I return to Boston, I am going to have you legally prosecuted for corporate espionage." I actually smiled. I looked across the desk at Beatrice, who offered a slow, approving nod. "I cannot transfer anything to you, Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to an icy, chilling calm. "I just concluded an emergency video conference with Mr. Caldwell. I presented him with the authenticated blind trust documents proving the property collateral is void and the signatures are forged. He immediately initiated a federal fraud alert with Vanguard National Bank. The bank locked down every single account, credit line, and secondary asset tied to your name globally. You did what Harrison roared, the sound so loud it distorted the speaker. I reported your bridge loan as felony bank fraud, I clarified. I froze every single account. You have absolutely zero access to any domestic or international liquid capital. You are stranded. You stupid, ungrateful little brat, Harrison screamed, losing his mind completely. The polished, wealthy patriarch persona completely disintegrated, revealing the desperate bully underneath. You think you can do this to me? You think you can destroy my life over a simple administrative error? I am your father. I built this family. If you do not wire funds to the hotel concierge desk within the next 5 minutes, I will call the American consulate and have you arrested. I will call the police and tell them you hijacked my grandchildren. You are kidnapping Leo and Mason. I will have you thrown in a federal prison. I let his empty, frantic threats ring out through the quiet mahogany study. I did not interrupt him. I let him expend all his toxic energy until he was left panting heavily into the receiver. Please call the police. Harrison, I said with absolute icy calm. I have David on the other line, and he is very interested in the exact routing numbers for Chelsea's offshore divorce fund. I severed the connection before Harrison could utter another frantic syllable. The abrupt silence that swept through the mahogany study was absolute, vibrating with the residual energy of his panic. Beatrice offered a small, approving nod, her posture immaculate and perfectly composed in the leather guest chair. We had successfully neutralized the immediate threat, exposed the theft, and trapped them in a web of their own making. I relayed the final offshore routing numbers to David, who immediately forwarded them to his legal counsel to append to the ex parte motion. The domestic war was won for the evening, but the fallout was only just beginning. The next morning dawned crisp and brilliantly clear. The early sunlight spilled across the expansive back patio of Harrison's suburban estate, catching the dew on the manicured lawn and making the expensive landscaping sparkle. Beatrice and I sat at the wrought iron patio table, enjoying freshly brewed black coffee. The scent of roasted beans mingled with the cool morning air, creating a deceptive atmosphere of domestic peace. Out on the sprawling green lawn, a minor miracle was unfolding. Leo and Mason were playing quietly with a set of wooden building blocks, attempting to construct a makeshift castle under the shade of a large oak tree. There was no screaming, no demanding of digital screens, and absolutely no throwing of expensive imported chocolates. My strict non-negotiable boundaries from the previous night had completely recalibrated their behavior. When Leo had attempted to bite me during a violent tantrum over his confiscated tablet, I had placed him firmly in a chair and refused to back down. I did not yell, I did not negotiate, and I certainly did not appease him the way Chelsea and Barbara always did. The boys had shrieked that they were going to call their mother to get me in trouble, completely unaware that their mother was currently shrieking in a blind panic at a French hotel concierge because her credit cards were declining. Stripped of an enabling audience, the boys had quickly realized that their usual tactics were entirely useless. They had calmed down, eaten a normal dinner of grilled chicken and vegetables without complaint, and respectfully helped clear their plates. It proved unequivocally that Chelsea was not overwhelmed by difficult, unmanageable children. She was simply a negligent, lazy parent who used screens and sugar to avoid doing the actual work of raising her sons. Beatrice took a slow sip of her coffee, her sharp eyes resting on her great-grandsons. We sat in companionable silence, appreciating the hard-won tranquility. I watched a pair of robins dart across the freshly cut grass, entirely unbothered by the catastrophic financial ruin currently descending upon the owners of this property. Harrison had built this house to be a monument to his own massive ego. It was a sprawling, excessive display of wealth, featuring imported Italian marble columns, custom mahogany fixtures, and a massive swimming pool that rarely saw any actual use. Every square foot of this property was designed to project an image of untouchable superiority. But the foundation of that image was built on lies, manipulation, and the relentless theft of Beatrice's assets. Now the bill was finally coming due. The tranquil quiet of the morning was abruptly shattered by the heavy crunch of gravel from the front circular driveway. The sound of heavy tires braking was followed by the slamming of car doors. I set my coffee mug down on the glass table. Beatrice did not flinch, but her gaze sharpened into focused readiness. We both knew we were not expecting any casual visitors today. I stood up, smoothed the front of my sweater, and walked through the sprawling kitchen toward the grand entryway. I pulled open the heavy double doors. A sleek black SUV was parked haphazardly near the front steps, flanked by two marked county sheriff cruisers. 5 men stood in the driveway, their presence casting a dark shadow over the bright morning. The first was Arthur Caldwell, Beatrice's ruthless estate attorney, looking just as predatory in the morning light as he had on the secure video call. He was accompanied by 2 men in sharp gray suits, holding thick leather briefcases, clearly corporate representatives from Vanguard National Bank. The local sheriff and a uniformed deputy stood slightly behind them, their hands resting near their utility belts, projecting an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch, the cool air biting through my thin sweater. Caldwell looked up, his gray eyes sweeping over the ostentatious property with a clinical calculating assessment. "Good morning, Sienna," Caldwell said, his voice carrying clearly over the gentle rustle of the wind in the trees. "I apologize for the abrupt intrusion, but the situation with Vanguard National Bank has accelerated significantly over the last 8 hours. I crossed my arms, maintaining a relaxed posture, despite the heavy law enforcement presence currently occupying my father's pristine driveway. "Good morning, Arthur. Beatrice is around back on the patio. What exactly has accelerated?" Caldwell gestured smoothly to the 2 men in the gray suits. "These gentlemen are the senior asset recovery agents for Vanguard. When we triggered the federal fraud alert last night, their underwriting department initiated an immediate emergency review of Harrison's entire portfolio. They discovered a fatal miscalculation on his part." I walked down the stone steps to meet them at the edge of the driveway. As a forensic accountant, I lived for uncovering fatal miscalculations. "What kind of miscalculation?" I asked. One of the bank representatives stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase and extracting a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy stock paper. "Your father attempted to secure a $500,000 commercial line of credit using a dummy deed for Silver Lake Manor." The agent explained, his tone strictly business and entirely unsympathetic. However, because his personal credit score lacked the necessary collateral ratio to secure an unverified commercial loan of that massive size, the automated underwriting system required a secondary backstop. Harrison bypassed standard risk assessment by cross-collateralizing his own primary residence. The agent pointed a rigid finger at the massive suburban house standing behind me. "He pledged this exact property as secondary collateral to guarantee the fraudulent funds he subsequently wired to the Cayman Islands." I stared at the bank representative, letting the sheer magnitude of Harrison's arrogance and stupidity sink in. He had been so desperate to steal Beatrice's money and fund Chelsea's offshore escape that he had literally bet his own house on a forged signature. He believed his dummy documents were completely bulletproof, and his ego blinded him to the basic mechanisms of corporate lending. "Because the primary collateral has been proven fraudulent," Caldwell interjected smoothly, taking over the explanation, "and because federal wire fraud has been officially reported across international borders, the bank's terms of service mandate immediate mitigation of their financial exposure. Vanguard is calling in the secondary collateral." I looked from Caldwell to the sheriff, the reality of the situation clicking perfectly into place. "You are executing an emergency asset seizure," I stated. "Precisely," Caldwell confirmed with a predatory half-smile that did not reach his eyes. "Harrison breached the covenant of his mortgage and committed a federal felony. The bank is seizing this property immediately to recoup the stolen $300,000 and freeze any remaining equity. The house no longer belongs to him. It is officially the property of Vanguard National Bank." The sheer poetic justice of it was overwhelming. Harrison had literally tried to evict his own mother from her care facility to save a few dollars, and in doing so, he had inadvertently handed the deed to his beloved suburban palace directly to the bank. He was currently trapped in Paris, completely cut off from his funds, throwing a pathetic tantrum at a hotel concierge, while a team of suits stood in his driveway, repossessing the very roof over his head. The local sheriff stepped forward, a grim expression on his weathered face. He held a metal clipboard containing several pages of brightly colored legal forms. "Ma'am, we are executing a court-ordered emergency eviction and asset lockdown," the sheriff stated formally. "We need everyone off the premises within the next 60 minutes. The bank will be changing all the locks and boarding the ground floor windows. Anything left inside will be impounded as bank property until the fraud investigation is completely concluded." He detached a thick, bright orange piece of heavy cardstock from his clipboard and handed it to me. The bold black letters spelled out the absolute ruin of Harrison Wells. It was a formal notice of asset seizure and eviction. I took the bright orange notice, the stiff paper feeling incredibly satisfying between my fingers. I turned around and walked slowly back up the stone steps toward the grand mahogany front doors. The sheriff and the bank representatives followed closely behind me to execute their orders. I flattened the eviction notice against the polished wood of the door right at eye level so it could not possibly be missed. The sheriff secured it with heavy industrial tape, making it an undeniable permanent fixture on the pristine facade. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened the camera application, flipped the lens to face me, and positioned myself perfectly in frame with the bright orange seizure notice glowing conspicuously directly behind my head. I offered a wide, bright, entirely genuine smile and snapped the picture. I opened the family group chat, which had been dead silent since their credit cards had violently declined at the Parisian hotel desk. I attached the photo, typed a quick message, and hit send. "Oops, looks like the house is gone. See you when you get back." I locked my phone screen and slid the device into my pocket, leaving the family group chat to absorb the absolute finality of the bright orange eviction notice. The digital silence that followed was deafening. For a family that usually communicated in a ceaseless barrage of demands, complaints, and passive-aggressive instructions, the complete electronic void was highly indicative of their total paralyzing shock. I spent the next 24 hours watching the spectacular real-time collapse of their European vacation through the estate monitoring software that Arthur Caldwell had granted me access to. The untouchable Wells family had been brutally stripped of their armor. Every single one of their primary black cards had violently declined. Their secondary emergency cards were entirely frozen. Chelsea's offshore accounts, which she had flaunted to her followers mere hours ago, were completely locked down by international authorities pending the federal fraud investigation. Left entirely stranded in a foreign country without a single cent of liquid capital, they had been reduced to begging. Caldwell forwarded me a highly satisfying email intercept. Harrison had been forced to contact his estranged cousin Robert in Omaha. Harrison had mercilessly mocked Robert for decades for managing a regional hardware store. Yet Harrison had to swallow his massive, fragile ego and beg Robert to purchase 3 emergency tickets back to the United States. They were not flying private. They were not flying first class. Robert had secured them standby economy class tickets on a brutal, multi-leg budget airline that routed through Reykjavik and Newark before finally heading to Boston. I pictured Chelsea dressed in her runway couture, crammed into a middle seat near the lavatories for a grueling 14-hour flight. The mental image was an absolute masterpiece of poetic justice. I was busy folding a stack of Mason's clothes when my phone vibrated against the kitchen island. It was a direct message from my mother. The sheer desperation in Barbara's text was a radical departure from her usual tone of icy aristocratic authority. She was no longer barking orders or threatening my position within the family hierarchy. She was deploying the ultimate weapon of a narcissist who had entirely run out of ammunition. She was playing the ultimate victim. "Sienna, please, you have to stop this right now. We are sitting in a terminal in Iceland and we have not eaten since yesterday because our cards will not even buy a stale sandwich. We are family. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Do not let them take the house. Your father is having chest pains, and Chelsea has not stopped crying for 2 straight days. She is completely hysterical. Please have a heart and call the bank to fix this." I read the message twice, letting the manipulative words wash over me. 5 years ago, a text exactly like that would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have dropped everything, drained my own meager savings, and frantically called the bank to reverse the damage. I would have set myself on fire to keep them warm, absorbing their stress as if it were my own personal failing. I would have bent over backwards to protect them from the consequences of their own toxic actions. But today, reading those desperate words, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no guilt. There was no anxiety. There was only a profound, impenetrable calm. I did not type out a long explanation. I did not justify my actions or remind her that Harrison had committed a federal felony by stealing from his own mother. I opened the keyboard, selected a single thumbs-up emoji, and hit send. I locked the screen and tossed the phone back onto the counter, entirely immune to their manufactured crisis. The bank representatives had given me exactly 60 minutes to vacate the Wells estate before they changed the locks and boarded the pristine ground floor windows. I packed Leo and Mason's essential belongings into 2 large duffel bags with 10 minutes to spare. The boys had been surprisingly cooperative throughout the entire ordeal. The absence of their mother's chaotic, enabling energy had left them docile and calm. The strict boundaries I had enforced the previous night had completely reset their behavior. They gathered their wooden blocks and followed my instructions without a single complaint. I loaded them into the back of my car and drove straight to David and Chelsea's marital home in the upscale Boston suburbs. I had barely finished unpacking the boys' bags in their respective bedrooms when a sleek silver sedan pulled into the driveway. David stepped out looking sharper and more resolute than I had seen him in years. The exhausted, beaten-down husband who had quietly endured Chelsea's endless financial abuse was completely gone. In his place was a man who had finally woken up and taken absolute control of his life. He walked up the front steps, carrying a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He had spent the last 48 hours executing a surgical strike on his own marital assets. Following the exact offshore routing numbers I had extracted from Harrison's files, David and his legal team had successfully traced every single dollar Chelsea had siphoned from their joint accounts. They had uncovered the hidden Cayman Islands shell corporation, the fraudulent wire transfers, and the systematic draining of their shared funds. Armed with undeniable proof of gross financial misconduct and marital fraud, David had secured an emergency court order. The judge had locked down all of Chelsea's access to their remaining domestic funds and granted David temporary full physical custody of the boys. "It is all verified," David said, his voice steady as he joined me on the front wrap-around porch. "My attorneys presented the routing numbers to the judge this morning. Chelsea has been hiding over $400,000 in that offshore account. The judge froze her access completely and issued an emergency custody mandate. She is walking into an absolute buzzsaw." "The bank officially seized Harrison's estate this morning," I replied, leaning against the wooden railing. "They taped an orange eviction notice to the front door and changed the locks. Your wife and my parents are currently on a standby flight from Newark. They should be landing any minute now." David nodded, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He tapped the heavy manila envelope against his palm. Inside were the freshly signed divorce papers, the emergency custody orders, and a comprehensive printout of her offshore financial felonies. We stood side by side on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The quiet suburban street was perfectly still. Then the distinct grating sound of grinding brake pads echoed from the corner. A cheap, beat-up yellow airport taxi turned onto the street. The vehicle was severely dented, covered in road grime, and sputtering dark exhaust as it lurched forward. It was the ultimate visual downgrade from the luxury black car service Chelsea exclusively utilized. The cab screeched to a halt directly in the driveway, the engine idling loudly. David stood tall on the porch, holding the thick manila envelope, his eyes locked on the back door of the cab, waiting in absolute silence for his wife to step out. The back door of the dented yellow taxi kicked open with a violent metallic screech. Chelsea stumbled out first. The pristine, untouchable billionaire heiress persona she had meticulously projected on social media just 48 hours ago had completely evaporated. Her designer silk travel outfit was severely wrinkled and stained with coffee. Her usually flawless blonde hair hung in limp, greasy strands around her face. She looked utterly exhausted, completely disheveled, and absolutely furious. Barbara emerged from the other side of the cab looking equally ravaged. She clutched a cheap plastic airport shopping bag instead of her usual Louis Vuitton tote. Harrison practically crawled out of the front passenger seat. His custom-tailored suit jacket was crumpled and his tie was missing entirely. The deep bags under his eyes spoke to a grueling 14-hour journey in standby economy seating. He slammed the taxi door shut with enough force to rock the entire vehicle. The taxi driver popped the trunk, but Harrison did not even wait for the luggage. He zeroed in on the massive mahogany front doors of his house, completely ignoring the presence of David and me standing on the wraparound porch. He marched up the stone steps, his face a mottled mask of dark crimson rage. He shoved a brass key into the front door lock and twisted it sharply. The lock did not budge. The heavy deadbolt had been entirely replaced by Vanguard National Bank that very morning. Harrison jiggled the key frantically. He slammed the side of his fist against the solid wood. "Open this door!" he roared, his voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "Open this damn door right now!" He grabbed the heavy brass handle and rattled it violently, throwing his shoulder against the wood. The door remained completely immovable. He stepped back, panting heavily, his chest heaving with exertion and pure narcissistic fury. It was only then that he finally registered our presence. He turned his bloodshot eyes toward me. "You disrespectful little dropout." Harrison spat the venom in his voice, sharp and familiar. "What have you done? Give me the new keys right now." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground on the top step, looking down at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small and insignificant. "I do not have the keys, Harrison," I stated calmly. "The bank changed the locks this morning. This property no longer belongs to you." Barbara let out a high-pitched, frantic gasp from the bottom of the stairs. "Sienna, how could you do this to your own family? We have been traveling in coach for 2 days. We had to sit next to the bathrooms. We had to beg Robert for ticket money. You have humiliated us over a simple misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding, Barbara," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "There was a $500,000 felony. You participated in the theft of Beatrice's assets to fund your daughter's offshore account." Chelsea pushed past her mother, her eyes locking onto David. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at him. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "Tell your psychotic sister-in-law to fix this right now. And where are my children? Bring Mason and Leo out here immediately. We are taking them to a hotel." David did not move. He stood tall, holding the thick manila envelope against his side. His posture was rigid and entirely unapologetic. "You are not taking the boys anywhere, Chelsea," David said, his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal authority she had never heard from him before. "They are safely inside, and they are staying with me." "Excuse me," Chelsea shrieked, taking a threatening step up the stairs. "You do not get to dictate terms to me, David. Bring me my sons." "I filed for an emergency custody order this morning," David replied, holding up the manila envelope. "A family court judge reviewed the documentation regarding the $400,000 you hid in a Cayman Islands shell corporation. The judge immediately granted me full physical custody and completely froze your access to our remaining joint accounts. You have absolutely nothing, Chelsea." Chelsea stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. The safety net she had spent months building through theft and manipulation had been entirely incinerated in a single afternoon. Harrison lost whatever tiny shred of control he had left. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged aggression. "You are all delusional," he screamed, pointing a finger directly at my face. "You think you can steal my property. You think you can lock me out of my own house over a clerical error. I will have you arrested for trespassing. I will have you thrown in jail for hacking my accounts." He lunged forward, taking the remaining steps 2 at a time. He raised his hand, his fist clenched, pulling his arm back to physically force his way past me to get to the door. The physical threat was sudden and violent, a desperate attempt to assert the physical dominance he had used to intimidate us for decades. Before his foot could even land on the top porch step, a figure detached from the shadows near the grand bay window. Mr. Caldwell stepped smoothly into the afternoon light, his dark charcoal suit immaculate, his silver hair catching the sun. "That would be an exceptionally foolish decision," Harrison Caldwell stated, his voice cutting through the chaotic screaming like a surgical scalpel. Simultaneously, two massive private security guards materialized from the sides of the wraparound porch. They wore matching black tactical suits and moved with terrifying synchronized speed. They stepped directly in front of me, forming an impenetrable human wall between Harrison and my physical space. Harrison froze, his raised hand dropping to his side as he stared at the two imposing figures blocking his path. Beatrice emerged from the house, stepping out onto the porch behind me. She leaned heavily on her silver-headed cane, but her posture was regal and utterly dominant. She looked down at her son with an expression of absolute disgust. "You always were a brute when cornered, Richard," Beatrice said, her voice sharp and dripping with aristocratic disdain. "It is pathetic to witness." Mother Harrison stammered, his aggression suddenly faltering as he faced the true matriarch of the family. "You have to listen to me. Sienna has completely lost her mind. She reported a simple bridge loan as fraud. She is trying to destroy the family." "Sienna followed my exact instructions," Beatrice replied coldly. "You forged my signature. You placed my assets in severe jeopardy to fund your daughter's exit strategy. You are a thief, Richard. You are a common criminal standing in a driveway you no longer own." Caldwell stepped around the security guards, closing the distance between himself and Harrison. He did not raise his voice. He did not show a single ounce of emotion. He projected the terrifying calm of a man who held the absolute power to dismantle lives. "I highly suggest you lower your voice and step off this porch," Caldwell instructed smoothly. "My private security detail is fully authorized to use physical force to remove trespassers from Vanguard Bank property. Furthermore, I have the local police department on speed dial. They are currently waiting at the end of the subdivision for my signal." Harrison swallowed hard, taking a slow, cautious step backward down the stairs. The bluster and rage drained right out of him, leaving a hollow, terrified shell of a man. "This is a civil dispute." Harrison tried weakly, his voice lacking any of its former power. "This is a family matter. We can settle this in probate court." "This ceased being a civil dispute the moment you wired stolen funds across international borders," Caldwell corrected. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation has already received the complete forensic audit of the wire fraud. The dummy deeds, the forged electronic signatures, and the offshore routing numbers have all been handed directly to the federal authorities. They are currently preparing the arrest warrants." Barbara let out a loud, choked sob, covering her face with her hands. Chelsea sank down onto the bottom step of the porch, completely defeated, her designer luggage sitting untouched in the trunk of the idling taxi. Caldwell reached into his tailored jacket and produced a thick, formal legal binder bound in dark leather. He held it out, extending it toward Harrison. Harrison stared at the binder as if it were a live explosive device. His hands shook violently as he reached out and took it. "You need to choose your next words very carefully," Richard Caldwell said, his tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "Because you aren't speaking to your daughter anymore. You are speaking to the executor of the Wells estate, who has just submitted your federal wire fraud files to the authorities." The heavy rusted door of the yellow airport taxi groaned in loud protest as Chelsea violently shoved it open. She practically stumbled out onto the asphalt. The pristine, untouchable billionaire heiress persona she had meticulously projected on social media just 48 hours ago had completely evaporated. Her designer silk travel outfit was severely wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. Her usually flawless blonde hair hung in limp, greasy strands around her face. She looked utterly exhausted, completely disheveled, and absolutely furious. Patricia and Harrison emerged from the other side of the cab, looking equally ravaged by their grueling standby economy flight. They had fallen from the absolute pinnacle of luxury to the lowest depths of public humiliation, and their faces were mottled masks of dark crimson rage. Chelsea took one look at the locked front doors of her childhood home, and then her eyes snapped toward the porch. she saw David standing tall holding the thick manila envelope. The transition was instantaneous. The furious, shrieking woman from the airport completely vanished, immediately replaced by the fragile, victimized damsel she had successfully played for her entire life. Tears welled in her eyes with practiced precision. "David!" She sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured relief. "Oh my God, David, you have no idea what we have been through." She stumbled forward, ignoring the presence of her parents and ignoring the heavy tension radiating from the porch. She rushed up the stone steps, with her arms outstretched, fully expecting her dutiful husband to catch her, to wrap her in his arms and shield her from the consequences of her own actions. "Sienna has completely lost her mind," Chelsea cried, attempting to bury her face in David's chest. "She hacked my father's accounts. She left us stranded in Europe. She kidnapped the boys. You have to stop her, David. She is absolutely crazy." David did not move a single inch. He did not open his arms. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He stood as rigid as a marble statue. Chelsea collided with his chest and bounced off, stumbling backward in genuine shock. She looked up at him, the fake tears momentarily stalling, as she registered the sheer, unadulterated contempt burning in his eyes. This was not the exhausted, accommodating man she had financially abused for a decade. This was a man who had finally seen behind the curtain and had spent the last 2 days legally barricading the doors. "Save the performance." "Chelsea," David said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal timbre that sent a visible shiver down her spine. "I know exactly what you did." He reached into the thick manila envelope and pulled out a stack of high-definition color printed financial statements. He held them up so the afternoon sun illuminated the offshore bank logos and the damning transaction histories. "You told me you were going to Paris to scout a new marketing venture?" David continued, his tone methodical and relentless. "You told me you needed time away to clear your head because being a mother was just so incredibly exhausting for you. You left your sons behind without a second thought. But you were not scouting a marketing venture. You were busy setting up an offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands under a maiden alias." David took a step forward, forcing Chelsea to retreat down a step. "You were busy hiding $300,000 in a private divorce fund so you could leave me and the boys entirely bankrupt while you lived out some twisted billionaire fantasy." He released his grip on the financial statements. The papers fluttered through the air, cascading down around Chelsea's designer heels like heavy, undeniable snow. The pages landed face up, displaying the exact routing numbers, the massive deposit, and the sole beneficiary name, which was Chelsea Wells. David pulled a second, thicker document from the manila envelope and shoved it directly into her trembling hands. "Those are divorce papers," David stated loudly, ensuring every single person in the driveway heard him clearly. "They have already been filed with the county clerk. Furthermore, the envelope contains an emergency court order granting me temporary full physical and legal custody of Leo and Mason. You abandoned your children to cross international borders and participate in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. You are legally classified as a severe flight risk and an unfit parent. You will not have access to our home, you will not have access to our joint accounts, and you will absolutely not have access to my sons." Chelsea stared down at the divorce papers in her hands, her jaw moving silently. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking ashen and hollow. Behind her, standing at the base of the porch steps, Patricia and Harrison had gone completely still. The reality of the scattered bank statements on the ground sliced through their own panic. Harrison had forged his mother's signature and illegally mortgaged his own home to secure a $500,000 line of credit. He had done it under the delusion that he was creating an untouchable family war chest. He had wired the bulk of that stolen capital to Chelsea, believing she was securing the funds in a joint offshore trust to protect their collective assets from Beatrice and the estate attorneys. "Wait a minute," Harrison growled, pushing past his wife and snatching one of the bank statements off the pavement. He scanned the document, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horror. He looked up at his golden child. "This account is registered solely in your name. You did not put my name on the corporate charter. You did not list Patricia as a secondary beneficiary. Patricia stepped forward, her voice trembling with profound disbelief. Chelsea, what did you do? Your father committed a felony to get that money. We lost our home for that money. We are facing federal prison time, and you kept all $300,000 entirely for yourself. I needed a safety net, Chelsea screamed, turning on her parents like a cornered viper. You two are a complete disaster. Sienna was closing in and Beatrice was threatening us, and I needed an escape route. I am not going down with your sinking ship. The perfect unified facade of the Wells family shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there in the driveway. Harrison lunged forward, grabbing Chelsea by the arm and screaming that she was a traitor and a selfish brat who had destroyed his life. Patricia burst into loud, hysterical tears, striking her husband's shoulder and wailing that they were all going to be arrested. The golden child had finally turned on her creators, proving she was nothing more than the ultimate product of their own toxic, narcissistic parenting. She had learned from the very best, and she had sold them out for a payout. The shouting match devolved into a vicious, chaotic spectacle. Chelsea ripped her arm away from Harrison and scrambled backward up the porch steps, desperately looking for an exit strategy. She looked past David and saw Leo and Mason standing near the open front door. The boys had wandered out from the kitchen, holding their wooden blocks, watching the screaming adults with wide, silent eyes. Chelsea immediately dropped to her knees on the hard stone porch. She stretched her arms out toward her children, reverting instantly to her frantic victim routine. Leo, Mason, my sweet babies! Chelsea sobbed, her voice echoing with manufactured desperation. Come here. Come to Mommy. Come hug me right now and we will leave. We have to get away from Aunt Sienna. She is bad. She is hurting our family. She knelt there, fully expecting her sons to run into her arms to provide her with the ultimate emotional shield against David's devastating legal strike. Leo stood perfectly still, clutching a blue wooden block to his chest. He did not move forward. Mason, the younger, and usually more compliant of the two, took a deliberate step backward. He looked down at his mother kneeling on the stone, his young face completely devoid of the usual anxious appeasement she demanded. He looked at her coldly with a profound, innocent clarity that sliced through all of her manipulation. No, Mason said, his small voice ringing out clearly in the sudden silence of the porch. Aunt Sienna is nicer. She actually feeds us dinner. Harrison stood frozen, clutching the heavy leather binder as if it were a physical shield. The absolute finality of Mr. Caldwell's words severed the last fragile thread of Harrison's manufactured authority. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had the wire fraud files. The bridge loan excuse was completely dead. Desperate to sidestep the crushing fraud allegations, Chelsea immediately shifted her tactics. Recognizing the sinking ship, her instinct for self-preservation kicked into overdrive. She spun away from her paralyzed father and ran directly toward the porch, her tear-streaked face fixed entirely on David. David, she sobbed, throwing her arms out in a display of dramatic performative exhaustion. Oh my God, David, I missed you and the boys so much. You have no idea what we have been through. Sienna is absolutely crazy. She hijacked my father's accounts and left us completely stranded in Europe. You have to tell them to stop this right now. David did not flinch. He did not step forward or offer a single word of comfort. He stood as rigid as a stone monument, his eyes radiating a quiet, lethal contempt. He unclasped the thick manila envelope and pulled out a stack of high-definition color-printed financial statements. Save the performance, Chelsea, David said, his voice dropping to a low, steady timbre that stopped her dead in her tracks. I know exactly what you did. You told me you needed time away to clear your head, but you were busy setting up an offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands under a maiden alias. He released his grip on the financial statements. The papers fluttered through the air, cascading down around Chelsea's designer heels. The pages landed face up, clearly displaying the offshore bank logos, the exact routing numbers, and the massive deposit history. David pulled a second, thicker document from the manila envelope and held it out. These are divorce papers, David announced, ensuring every single person in the driveway heard him clearly. They have already been filed. Furthermore, I am filing for full physical and legal custody of Leo and Mason, citing your documented abandonment of them during the holidays to commit marital fraud. You will not have access to our home, you will not have access to our accounts, and you will not have access to my sons. The perfect facade of the Wells family crumbled entirely as the financial statements settled onto the pavement. Barbara and Harrison stared down at the scattered papers, their own panic momentarily overridden by a profound, horrific realization. Harrison dropped to his knees and snatched a page from the ground, his eyes scanning the corporate charter details. He looked up at his golden child, his face a mask of absolute betrayal. "You took $300,000. Harrison roared, his voice cracking with fury. "We lost our home for that money. We are facing federal prison time, and you were hoarding the stolen funds in a secret account for yourself. I needed a safety net," Chelsea screamed back, stepping away from her father. "You two are a complete disaster." Sienna was closing in, and I needed an escape route. I am not going down with your sinking ship. The Golden family was suddenly turning on each other like rabid wolves, tearing into the very foundation of their toxic dynamic. Chelsea realized she was entirely cornered. She looked past David and saw Leo and Mason standing near the open front door, holding their wooden blocks. She immediately dropped to her knees on the hard stone porch, reverting instantly to her frantic victim routine. "Leo, Mason, my sweet babies!" Chelsea cried out, extending her trembling arms toward her children. "Come here. Come hug Mommy. We have to get away from Aunt Sienna. She is hurting our family." She knelt there, expecting her sons to provide her with the ultimate emotional shield. Leo stood perfectly still. Mason, the younger, and usually more compliant of the two, took a deliberate step backward. He looked down at his mother, kneeling on the stone, his young face completely devoid of the usual anxious appeasement she demanded. "No," Mason said, his small voice ringing out clearly in the sudden silence of the porch. "Aunt Sienna is nicer. She actually feeds us dinner." The sheer weight of Mason's innocent, unfiltered truth slammed into Chelsea with the force of a freight train. She slumped forward, burying her face in her hands and letting out a ragged, agonizing wail. David stepped backwards smoothly, pulling the heavy mahogany door until it clicked shut, placing a solid physical barrier between his sons and the toxic wreckage of the Wells family. Seeing her golden child completely neutralized and her husband reduced to a trembling shell, Barbara realized their unified front was entirely dead. The aristocratic superiority that had defined her personality vanished in an instant. She wiped her tear-stained face, frantically scanning the porch for any remaining shred of leverage. Her eyes locked onto me, standing calmly beside Beatrice and Mr. Caldwell. Barbara made a sudden, desperate calculation. She dropped the arrogant facade she had wielded like a weapon for 30 years and pivoted to the only tactic she had left. Barbara scrambled up the first 2 steps of the porch, her hands clasped together in a frantic, pleading gesture. She fell to her knees right beside her sobbing daughter, tearing at the collar of her ruined silk blouse. "Sienna, please," Barbara wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "I am your mother. I gave you life. You cannot do this to us. You cannot let us be homeless over a financial mistake. We are your family. You have to tell them to stop." She reached out, trying to grab the hem of my sweater. I took a single deliberate step backward, out of her reach. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life, making me feel completely invisible. The emotional manipulation that used to send me into spirals of anxiety felt entirely hollow. I crossed my arms over my chest, maintaining a posture of absolute unshakable calm. I delivered the ultimate reality check with clinical precision. "You did not give me life, Barbara," I stated clearly, my voice echoing across the silent driveway. "You gave me a lifetime of being your dedicated scapegoat. You gave me 30 years of constant criticism, emotional neglect, and profound psychological abuse. You spent my entire existence comparing me to a sister who was actively stealing from her own husband." Barbara gasped, her eyes wide with shock. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand, silencing her instantly. "Do not dare play the victim right now." I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, icy register, completely immune to her emotional manipulation. You left me with two traumatized children on a major holiday so you could drink vintage champagne on stolen money. You gladly participated in the systematic draining of my grandmother's assets to fund a luxury vacation. You knew exactly what Harrison was doing. You knew Chelsea was hiding money offshore. You were completely complicit in a federal wire fraud conspiracy because you thought your social status made you immune to the law. Sienna, we had no idea it was illegal. Barbara cried out, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. We did not mean to hurt anyone. We just wanted to protect our lifestyle. You cannot let them throw us out on the street. I refused to yield a single inch. The decades of conditioning that demanded I comfort her were entirely gone. You are not homeless, Barbara. I said, my words striking her like physical blows. You are just finally facing the consequences of your own actions. You built an entire empire on lies, fraud, and the exploitation of your own family members. You enabled Chelsea's toxic behavior because she fit your perfect aesthetic while you treated me like the hired help. You thought you could use my loyalty as a weapon against me, but that loyalty is gone. I am no longer your safety net. I am the person who audited your financial crimes and handed the evidence directly to the authorities. Harrison let out a low, guttural groan from the bottom of the stairs, slowly sinking down onto the bumper of the idling airport taxi. The realization hit him with staggering force. There was no secret account left to tap. There was no high-powered attorney willing to take their case without a massive retainer they could no longer afford. The entire family realized simultaneously that they had absolutely zero leverage left. They were trapped in a prison of their own meticulous design. The heavy, oppressive silence that settled over the driveway was suddenly broken by a sharp, piercing sound in the distance. It started as a faint, high-pitched whine, carrying on the cool afternoon wind. Within seconds, the sound amplified, growing louder and more distinct. It was the unmistakable, aggressive wail of emergency sirens. Harrison's head snapped up. Barbara scrambled to her feet, clutching the wooden railing of the porch for support. Chelsea stopped crying, her breath catching in her throat as she stared down the quiet suburban street. The sirens were not passing by on the main highway. They were turning directly into the affluent subdivision. They were getting closer. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pristine manicured lawns and the expensive imported sports cars parked in the neighboring driveways. The noise was deafening, cutting through the tranquil atmosphere of the upscale neighborhood. Two marked local police cruisers turned the corner aggressively. They accelerated down the street, their tires screeching as they braked hard and pulled directly into the driveway of David and Chelsea's marital home. They parked at sharp angles, completely blocking the beat-up yellow airport taxi from leaving. The blinding emergency lights painted the entire scene in harsh, alternating strokes of crimson and blue. The doors of the cruisers opened in unison, and four uniformed officers stepped out, their hands resting casually on their duty belts. They were not there for the eviction anymore. They were there with active warrants. The lead officer, a tall man with a severe expression, walked directly toward the porch. The flashing emergency lights bounced off the manicured hedges and the pristine white columns of the estate, drawing the attention of the entire neighborhood. Doors opened down the block. Curtains twitched in the massive bay windows of the adjacent properties. The affluent residents of the exclusive subdivision stepped out onto their perfectly trimmed lawns, holding their phones and watching in stunned silence as the untouchable Harrison Wells faced his absolute ruin. Harrison Richard Wells, the lead officer, announced, his voice booming with unquestionable authority over the chaotic scene. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Harrison stumbled backward, his face draining of all remaining color. He raised his hands defensively, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. There is a mistake, he stammered, taking another shaky step away from the officers. This is a family dispute. You cannot arrest me on my own property. I know the mayor. I play golf with the police chief. You have absolutely no right to do this. The officers did not hesitate. They did not entertain his arrogant delusions of grandeur. Two officers flanked him, immediately grabbing his arms and spinning him around with practiced efficiency. The harsh metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the quiet evening air. It was the definitive sound of his carefully constructed empire collapsing. Harrison let out a sharp gasp of pain and humiliation as they marched him down the stone steps. The man who had spent his entire life projecting dominance and superiority was now being perp-walked across his own driveway. His expensive suit was crumpled, his posture was completely broken, and he kept his head bowed to avoid the stares of his wealthy neighbors. They guided him toward the back of the cruiser, pressing a hand to his head as they forced him into the back seat. The door slammed shut, trapping him in the flashing neon glow of the emergency lights. Seeing her father physically detained and shoved into the back of a police vehicle, Chelsea finally completely unraveled. The sophisticated cosmopolitan heiress vanished, entirely replaced by a hysterical, sobbing mess. She collapsed onto the hard concrete curb, her designer silk outfit soaking up the dirty water pooling near the storm drain. She buried her face in her hands, wailing with a raw, primal panic. "David," she screamed, her voice tearing through the crisp air. "David, please do not do this. Do not leave me here. I have absolutely nothing. I have nowhere to go. Please let me see my boys." David did not even look in her direction. He moved with a calm, methodical precision that highlighted just how thoroughly he had detached himself from her toxicity. He guided Leo and Mason toward his silver sedan, opening the back doors and helping them into their car seats. The boys did not cry. They did not reach out for their mother. They settled into their seats, completely unfazed by the hysterical woman sobbing on the curb. Mason even rolled up his window, blocking out the sound of her frantic screaming. David closed the back doors securely and walked around to the driver's side. He paused for a brief second, resting his hand on the roof of the car. He looked at the chaos unfolding in the driveway, at Harrison locked in the police cruiser, and at Chelsea sobbing in the gutter. He did not offer a single word of parting advice or fake sympathy. He simply opened his door, got into his car, and started the engine. He put the vehicle in reverse, backed smoothly out of the driveway, and drove away down the tree-lined street without looking back once. Barbara stood frozen near the base of the porch steps, watching her entire world violently disintegrate. Her husband was on his way to a federal holding cell. Her golden child was a weeping mess on the pavement, abandoned by her husband and her children. The generational wealth and untouchable status Barbara had wielded like a heavy club for decades had vanished into thin air. She slowly turned her gaze toward me. The arrogant, aristocratic matriarch who had constantly belittled my existence was entirely gone. She fell heavily to her knees on the stone pathway, the impact tearing the fabric of her tailored trousers. She crawled forward, reaching out with trembling hands toward the hem of my sweater. "Sienna, please," she begged, her voice a ragged, desperate whisper. "You have to help us. You have the power to stop this. Tell Mr. Caldwell to release the funds. Tell him to pay your father's bail with Beatrice's money. It is just a drop in the bucket for the estate. We cannot survive this, Sienna. I cannot be left out here on the street. You have to fix this right now." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me but had never truly been a mother. I searched my heart for even a flicker of pity or residual familial obligation. I found absolutely nothing but cold, hard clarity. "You want me to use the very money Harrison attempted to steal to pay for his release?" I asked, my voice projecting an icy clinical detachment. "You want me to dip into the funds you happily plotted to drain so you could rescue the man who forged his own mother's signature?" Barbara sobbed uncontrollably, nodding her head frantically. "Yes, please, Sienna. We will pay it back. We will make it right. Just do not let them take everything away from us." I stepped to the side, entirely ignoring her pleading hands. I turned my attention to Mr. Caldwell and the Vanguard National Bank property manager, who had been quietly observing the scene from the safety of the porch. The manager held a specialized electronic clipboard containing the final asset transfer documents. "Are we completely finalized?" I asked Caldwell, ignoring the chaotic weeping echoing from the driveway. Caldwell nodded, handing me a sleek metallic pen. "The federal authorities have full jurisdiction over the wire fraud investigation," he confirmed smoothly, "and Vanguard has officially executed the secondary collateral clause. All we need is your signature as the acting proxy for the estate to legally sever all ties to this specific property." I took the pen and signed my name on the digital screen with a profound sense of absolute finality. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key to the front door, and dropped it directly into the property manager's outstretched palm. The estate officially relinquishes all claims and responsibilities regarding this address, I stated clearly, ensuring the legal transfer was completely unambiguous. We are entirely done here. I turned back to the driveway. Barbara was still kneeling on the cold stone, her tear-streaked face staring up at me in absolute horror. She finally realized that the dutiful, compliant scapegoat she had relied upon for decades was entirely dead. There was no safety net left. There was no one coming to rescue her from the catastrophic consequences of her own boundless greed. Sienna Barbara gasped, clutching her chest, as if she could not draw enough air into her lungs. How are we supposed to get out of here? The bank froze our accounts. We do not have a single dollar for a hotel. We do not even have a car. How are we supposed to leave? I looked down at her, completely immune to her manufactured panic. I thought back to the very moment she had abandoned me in the foyer of this exact house days ago, dismissing my desperate warnings about the estate audit, so she could drink champagne on stolen money. I remembered her callous disregard for the massive financial crisis she had helped orchestrate. I adjusted my sweater, offering her a tight smile that was utterly devoid of warmth. I looked her dead in the eye and echoed the exact words she had used to dismiss me. Try Uber. I did not wait for her reaction. I turned on my heel and walked gracefully toward the sleek black town car Mr. Caldwell had arranged for us. Beatrice was already seated comfortably in the back, her silver-headed cane resting across her lap, an expression of profound satisfaction settling across her weathered features. I slid into the plush leather seat beside my grandmother and closed the heavy door with a solid, satisfying thud. The driver smoothly shifted into gear and guided the vehicle out of the chaotic driveway. As we rolled past the flashing lights of the remaining police cruisers, I looked out the tinted window one last time. Barbara remained kneeling alone in the center of the driveway, shivering in the cooling afternoon air. Chelsea was still curled into a tight ball on the curb, weeping into her ruined silk sleeves. Behind them, the Vanguard Bank representatives had already begun their work. The harsh grinding sound of power drills echoed down the street as a team of contractors hoisted thick, heavy wooden panels over the pristine bay windows, violently sealing up the massive estate, leaving the Golden family entirely locked out in the cold. Exactly 1 month had passed since the heavy wooden panels were violently drilled over the front windows of the Wells estate. The transition from that chaotic, flashing driveway to my current reality felt like waking up from a suffocating, decades-long nightmare. I sat at the smooth quartz island of my newly upgraded apartment, basking in the warm, late-afternoon sunlight that flooded through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was immaculate and profoundly quiet. There was no walking on eggshells, no bracing for the inevitable sound of Harrison's booming demands, and no waiting for Barbara's sharp, aristocratic critiques. The air in this high-rise apartment belonged entirely to me. It was clean and it was completely free. Down the hall in the exact same luxury building, Beatrice had settled into a beautiful premium suite. It was a massive upgrade from the isolated cold wing they had confined her to in the old house. Her new home was flooded with natural light, featuring a wrap-around balcony and 24-hour concierge service. The entire arrangement was fully funded by her secure, untouchable trust. The very same trust Harrison and Chelsea had so desperately tried to drain. The estate attorneys had moved swiftly in the wake of the arrests, locking down every single asset and ensuring Beatrice would live out the rest of her days in absolute comfort and absolute control. I visited her every morning for coffee. Our dynamic had shifted entirely. The weary, suspicious grandmother who had hoarded documents in her bathrobe had vanished. In her place sat a sharp, vibrant woman who looked 10 years younger. She no longer had to constantly look over her shoulder. The heavy, crushing burden of her son's boundless greed had been permanently lifted from her shoulders. She spent her afternoons reading in her sunroom and her evenings enjoying peaceful dinners without the constant fear of being manipulated into signing away her legacy. During our morning visits, she would look at me with a deep, earned respect. She knew I had stood my ground against the entire family to protect her. I had proven my loyalty not with empty words, but with decisive, undeniable action. We had survived the toxic wreckage together, and our bond was now forged in absolute iron. I finished my coffee and walked over to the entryway console to sort through the small stack of mail I had brought up from the lobby. There were a few standard bills, a magazine subscription, and a glossy catalog. Tucked beneath a utility statement was a heavy gray envelope. The return address caught my eye immediately, and a cold, familiar jolt shot through my nervous system. The stamp in the top left corner indicated it was sent from a high-security federal holding facility. The name, printed in sharp, aggressive block letters across the top, was Harrison Wells. He was currently awaiting trial for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and a myriad of other financial crimes the authorities had unearthed during their extensive audit. He had been denied bail. The flight risk associated with Chelsea's offshore accounts and his own desperate financial ruin had made the judge extremely unsympathetic to his pleas for pretrial release. The gray envelope felt heavy in my hands, acting as a physical manifestation of the lingering toxicity he was trying to project from behind bars. For 30 years, a letter from my father would have sent me into a spiral of anxious appeasement. I would have dropped everything to read it, to decipher his anger, to figure out how I could fix whatever problem he was blaming me for. The conditioning ran deep. My thumb slid under the paper flap, tearing it open. I pulled out the single sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was jagged and furious. I read the very first line. "Sienna, you have completely destroyed your own father, and you will burn for what you have done to this family." I stopped reading right there. I did not read the second line. I did not read the desperate justifications, the classic manipulations, or the inevitable demands for me to contact the lawyers and fix his catastrophic mess. The old Sienna would have read every single word, internalizing his toxic rage and allowing it to poison her peace. The new Sienna felt absolutely nothing. There was no guilt, and there was no sense of misplaced duty. I turned away from the kitchen island and walked directly to the heavy-duty paper shredder tucked beneath my home office desk. I flipped the power switch. The machine hummed to life with a low, steady vibration. I held the lined paper over the metal teeth and let go. The shredder caught the edge, pulling Harrison's furious accusations down into the grinding blades. The sharp, mechanical whirring sound was incredibly satisfying. I watched the paper turn into tiny, meaningless ribbons. I did not read past the first line because his words no longer carried any weight. He had no power over my emotions. He had no leverage over my future. The final tie to the Wells family was permanently and effortlessly severed. I grabbed my car keys and my coat, feeling lighter than I had in years. I had an important stop to make before the evening settled in. I took the elevator down to the secure parking garage and climbed into my car. The drive out to the suburbs was smooth and clear. The sprawling, affluent neighborhoods I used to associate with Chelsea's oppressive aesthetic gave way to a quieter, more grounded community. I pulled into the driveway of David's new house. It was a modest but warm split-level home, surrounded by old oak trees and a sturdy wooden fence. The front porch was cluttered with muddy rain boots and colorful chalk drawings. It was entirely different from the cold, sterile mansion Chelsea had demanded they live in. This house actually looked like a home. I grabbed the two brightly wrapped packages from the passenger seat. They were late holiday presents. The chaos of the arrests, the eviction, and the legal fallout had completely derailed the holidays. But I was determined to make sure Leo and Mason received their gifts. I walked up the pathway and rang the doorbell. Within seconds, the door swung open. Leo and Mason stood in the entryway, their eyes wide with excitement. They were wearing comfortable sweatpants and mismatched superhero shirts. They looked relaxed, healthy, and genuinely happy. There was no underlying tension, no quiet fear of setting off their mother's unpredictable temper. Aunt Sienna Mason yelled, launching himself forward and wrapping his small arms around my legs. Leo followed immediately, hugging my waist tightly. I crouched down, balancing the presents on my knee, and hugged them back, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and feeling a profound wave of gratitude. They were safe. They were thriving in a structured, loving environment. David walked up behind them, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He looked exhausted, but there was a distinct peace in his eyes that had not been there for a decade. The heavy, crushing weight of Chelsea's financial and emotional abuse was gone. He had secured full physical custody during the emergency hearings. Chelsea was currently living in a cheap motel across town, her assets completely frozen, fighting a losing battle against the divorce proceedings while simultaneously trying to dodge her own impending federal indictments. "Thank you for coming," David said, offering a genuine warm smile. "The boys have been asking about you all week." "I would not miss it," I replied, handing the packages over to the boys, who immediately tore into the wrapping paper with unbridled joy. I stood up and met David's gaze. There was a quiet, mutual understanding passing between us. We had both been trapped in the gravitational pull of the Wells family. We had both been used, manipulated, and discarded when we no longer served their narrative. But we had both survived. We had protected the people who actually mattered. We chatted for a few minutes, watching the boys play with their new building sets on the living room rug. David offered me a cup of coffee, but I politely declined. I wanted to leave them to their peaceful evening. I said my goodbyes, hugging the boys one more time, and walked back out to my car. The drive back into the city was serene. The streetlights illuminated the darkening roads, casting long shadows across the pavement. I merged onto the highway, letting the steady rhythm of the tires ground me in the present moment. I thought about my career. It was thriving. With the massive shadow of my family finally removed, I had poured my energy entirely into my work. My firm had officially finalized my promotion to senior auditor, recognizing my meticulous attention to detail and my unshakable integrity. I had total financial control over my own destiny. There were no secret loans, no forged signatures, and no hidden offshore accounts. Every dollar I earned was mine, and every success I achieved was built on my own merit. I parked in my designated spot beneath my building and rode the elevator up to my floor. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside. The city lights sparkled through the large windows, creating a breathtaking panoramic view of the skyline. I took off my coat and walked into the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of crisp white wine. I poured a generous measure into a crystal glass, enjoying the soft, chiming sound of the liquid hitting the rim. I walked over to the expansive windows and looked out over the glittering city. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. The taste was sharp, clean, and perfectly chilled. I closed my eyes and listened to the atmosphere of my home. There was no shouting. There was no crying. There was no manipulative whispering. There was only profound, absolute silence. It was the beautiful, heavy silence of a life finally entirely free from toxicity. The Golden family had burned their own empire to the ground, but I had walked out of the ashes completely untouched. I took another sip of my wine, savoring the ultimate freedom of simply being left alone. The journey from being the family scapegoat to finding absolute freedom is rarely a straight line. For years, I believed that if I just worked harder, accommodated more, and stayed quiet, I would eventually earn the love and respect of my parents, Barbara and Harrison, and my sister, Chelsea. But toxic family dynamics do not operate on logic or fairness. They operate on control, manipulation, and the exploitation of your empathy. What this entire ordeal taught me is that you cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. The Wells family empire was built on a foundation of lies, fraud, and the emotional destruction of anyone who dared to step out of line. When the authorities closed in and the stolen money dried up, their loyalty to each other evaporated instantly. They turned on one another like cornered animals because their connections were never rooted in genuine love. The ultimate lesson here is that setting unbreakable boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. Walking away from toxic blood relatives does not make you a bad person. It makes you a survivor. True family is not defined by DNA or shared history. It is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and the peace you feel when you are with them. I found my true family in my grandmother Beatrice, in David, and his boys, and most importantly, in myself. I learned that the most powerful weapon you can wield against narcissists is your own unshakable indifference. Share your story in the comments below if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family environment to protect your own peace. Please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power and defining your own worth.